A prince walks away from a palace at midnight, leaving behind wealth that could buy nations, a wife who adores him, and a newborn son who will never know his father. He carries nothing but questions that burn like acid in his mind. Within hours he will trade silk robes for rags, a comfortable bed for the forest floor, guaranteed meals for the uncertainty of begging. Most people would call this the story of a man losing his sanity. History calls it the birth of one of humanity's most penetrating investigations into the nature of reality itself. What emerged from this radical experiment in human consciousness would not merely offer comfort to the suffering, but would dissect suffering like a master surgeon, revealing its hidden anatomy and precise mechanisms. This is not just another spiritual teaching promising peace and happiness. This is a complete manual for psychological liberation, tested across 25 centuries by millions of practitioners, refined through countless generations of careful observation. The insights that follow represent perhaps the most systematic analysis of human consciousness ever undertaken. They offer not beliefs to adopt, but experiments to conduct in the laboratory of your own mind. They reveal not what you should think, but how thinking itself operates, how suffering is manufactured, and how the very sense of being a separate self is constructed moment by moment in awareness. Part 1. The Surgical Precision of Awakening. The Buddha's genius lay not in his mystical experiences, but in his ability to analyze those experiences with scientific rigor. Unlike other spiritual teachers who spoke in metaphors and poetry, he dissected consciousness like a skilled anatomist, identifying its component parts and revealing how they function together to create both suffering and liberation. This analytical approach makes Buddhist psychology remarkably practical and verifiable. Every insight can be tested through direct experience. The foundation of this entire system rests on 4 observations so simple they sound almost trivial, yet so profound they can completely restructure how consciousness relates to reality. These are called the 4 Noble Truths, though the word truth is misleading in English. In the original language, the term is closer to noble realities or ennobling insights. They are not beliefs to accept, but realities to investigate and directly perceive. The first noble truth states that life contains dukkha, usually translated as suffering, but encompassing a much broader range of unsatisfactory experience. The Buddha identified this not through pessimism, but through unflinching observation of how consciousness actually operates. He noticed that even pleasant experiences carry within them a subtle undertone of incompleteness, a sense that something is always slightly off, never quite perfect. Consider your experience of eating when hungry. The first few bites bring genuine satisfaction, but notice what happens as the meal continues. The pleasure gradually diminishes until eating becomes mechanical, then uncomfortable if you continue too long. This is not a problem with food or hunger. This is the nature of all conditioned experience. It arises, peaks, and then inevitably declines, leaving consciousness to seek the next source of satisfaction. But the Buddha's analysis goes much deeper than this obvious pattern. He identified 3 distinct levels of dukkha that operate simultaneously in all conscious experience. The first level is dukkha, obvious suffering that everyone recognizes. Physical pain, emotional distress, the agony of losing what you love, the frustration of not getting what you want. This level needs no explanation because it announces itself clearly to consciousness. The second level, viparinama dukkha, is far more subtle and therefore more dangerous. This is the suffering that comes from the impermanent nature of all conditioned phenomena. Every pleasurable experience contains the seeds of its own dissolution. Every moment of happiness is simultaneously a moment moving toward the end of that happiness. This creates a subtle but persistent anxiety that permeates even the most enjoyable experiences. You cannot fully relax into pleasure, because some part of you is already anticipating its loss. Think about falling in love, one of life's most ecstatic experiences. Even in the heights of romantic bliss, there is usually an undercurrent of insecurity. Will this last? What if they change their mind? What if I am not worthy of this love? These anxieties arise not because something is wrong, but because consciousness intuitively recognizes the impermanent nature of all conditioned experience. The more precious something becomes, the more vulnerable you feel to its potential loss. The third level, Sankhara Dukkha, penetrates deepest of all and represents the Buddha's most original psychological insight. This is the suffering that comes from being a conscious entity constantly engaged in the process of becoming. Even when nothing is obviously wrong, even when circumstances are favorable, there remains a fundamental restlessness at the core of ordinary consciousness. This is not neurosis or psychological dysfunction. This is the natural result of consciousness identifying with patterns that are constantly changing. Imagine trying to build a stable sense of identity on quicksand. Every thought you think disappears almost immediately. Every emotion you feel changes into something else. Every sensation in your body is constantly shifting. Your beliefs evolve, your preferences change, your memories fade and distort. Even your physical body replaces nearly all its cells every 7 years. Yet something in consciousness keeps trying to find solid ground in this flux, keeps attempting to establish a permanent reference point in an ocean of change. This constant effort to solidify the fluid creates a persistent underlying tension. The Buddha observed that this third level of suffering is so fundamental to ordinary consciousness that most people do not even recognize it. It operates like background radiation, coloring every experience with a subtle sense of incompleteness. This is why even people with comfortable lives, loving relationships and meaningful work often feel that something essential is missing. This is why achieving long-desired goals often brings less satisfaction than expected. This is why consciousness keeps seeking the next experience, the next achievement, the next solution to the puzzle of existence. But the Buddha's analysis of suffering extends even further into the mechanics of how different types of dukkha interact and reinforce each other. He noticed that consciousness develops elaborate strategies to avoid obvious suffering, but these strategies often increase the more subtle forms. The pursuit of pleasure as an escape from pain creates attachment, which increases vulnerability to the suffering of change. The attempt to build a secure identity creates rigid patterns of thinking and behavior, which increases the suffering of constantly trying to maintain something that is inherently fluid. He also observed that consciousness tends to blame external circumstances for its suffering, leading to endless attempts to rearrange the world rather than understanding the internal mechanisms that create dissatisfaction. People change jobs, relationships, locations, belief systems, thinking that the right external configuration will finally provide lasting contentment. But because the fundamental problem lies in how consciousness relates to experience rather than in the content of experience, these external changes provide only temporary relief before the underlying patterns reassert themselves. The first noble truth also reveals the Buddha's radical departure from other spiritual and philosophical traditions of his time. Most religious systems of his era focused on achieving union with cosmic forces, appeasing deities, or purifying the soul for a better afterlife. The Buddha focused instead on understanding the precise mechanisms through which consciousness creates its own suffering. This made his approach fundamentally therapeutic rather than mystical, practical rather than metaphysical. His analysis showed that suffering is not punishment for sin, not the result of cosmic injustice, not even primarily caused by external circumstances. Suffering is a byproduct of specific mental processes that can be observed, understood, and ultimately transformed. This insight removes suffering from the realm of theology and places it squarely in the domain of psychology and cognitive science. It suggests that liberation is not about changing the world or appeasing unseen forces, but about understanding and working skillfully with the mind itself. The Buddha also recognized that different people experience these three levels of suffering with different intensities depending on their psychological development and life circumstances. Someone dealing with severe illness or poverty will be primarily concerned with the first level of obvious suffering. Someone with comfortable external circumstances but high sensitivity might be more aware of the second level, the subtle anxiety that accompanies all impermanent pleasures. Someone with considerable psychological development might become conscious of the third level, the underlying restlessness that persists even in states of relative contentment. This recognition led to the development of graduated teachings appropriate for different levels of understanding and different temperaments. The Buddhist path offers practical methods for working with obvious suffering through ethical conduct and basic meditation techniques. It provides more advanced practices for those ready to investigate the subtle suffering that comes from attachment to changing conditions. And it offers the most refined methods for those prepared to examine the deepest level of suffering that comes from the very structure of ordinary consciousness. The First Noble Truth concludes with perhaps the most important recognition of all. The acknowledgement of suffering is not meant to create despair or resignation. It is meant to create what the Buddha called spiritual urgency, a motivation so profound that it can sustain the effort required for complete psychological transformation. When you clearly see how much energy is wasted in the constant attempt to avoid unavoidable aspects of existence, you naturally begin looking for more skillful approaches. When you recognize how much suffering comes from futile resistance to the nature of reality, you become genuinely interested in learning how to work with reality as it actually is. Part 2. The Anatomy of Craving. The Second Noble Truth represents perhaps the Buddha's most psychologically sophisticated insight, one that would not be matched in Western psychology for over 2 millennia. Having identified the universal presence of suffering in conscious experience, he turned his analytical attention to its causes. What he discovered was not a list of external factors that create problems, but a precise internal mechanism that operates constantly beneath the threshold of ordinary awareness. This mechanism is called tanha in the original language, usually translated as craving, but encompassing a much more subtle and pervasive process than the English word suggests. Craving is not simply wanting things. It is the quality of desperation that can infuse any form of desire, the sense that your psychological well-being depends on obtaining, maintaining, or avoiding particular experiences. The Buddha identified 3 distinct types of craving that operate simultaneously in ordinary consciousness, each creating its own form of suffering, each reinforcing the others in complex feedback loops. Understanding these three types provides a complete map of how consciousness traps itself in dissatisfaction. The first type, kamatanha, is craving for sensual pleasure. This includes not just sexual desire, but the entire range of ways consciousness seeks satisfaction through the five senses. The anticipation of a delicious meal when hungry, the desire for physical comfort when uncomfortable, the craving for beautiful sights and sounds and textures. This type of craving seems natural and even necessary for survival, which is why it operates so powerfully and why most people never question its fundamental nature. But the Buddha's analysis revealed something remarkable about sensual craving that most people never notice. The satisfaction it provides is always temporary and always requires increasing stimulation to maintain the same level of pleasure. This is not a moral judgment, but a description of how consciousness actually functions when it becomes dependent on external stimuli for its sense of well-being. The first taste of chocolate is intensely satisfying, the second slightly less so, the third even less, until continued eating becomes mechanical or even unpleasant. More importantly, sensual craving creates a fundamental dependency relationship between consciousness and external conditions. When you need particular experiences to feel complete, you become psychologically vulnerable to the availability of those experiences. This vulnerability manifests as anxiety when desired experiences are unavailable, as clinging when they are present, and as constant seeking when they are absent. The mind becomes like a drug addict, requiring regular fixes of pleasant experiences to maintain psychological equilibrium. The second type, bhavatanha, is craving for existence or becoming. This operates at a much deeper level than sensual desire and is therefore more difficult to recognize. It manifests as the persistent drive to establish, maintain, and expand a sense of personal identity. The desire to become someone important, to achieve lasting accomplishment, to leave a permanent mark on the world. But it also includes subtler forms, like the need to be right in arguments, the compulsion to defend your opinions, the drive to maintain consistency in your self-image. This type of craving reveals consciousness's desperate attempt to create something permanent out of experiences that are fundamentally impermanent. Every thought you think disappears almost immediately, yet something in the mind keeps trying to build a solid identity out of these vanishing mental events. Every role you play changes depending on circumstances, yet consciousness keeps seeking a stable sense of who you are. Every achievement eventually becomes old news, yet the drive to become something continues unabated. The Buddha observed that craving for existence creates a particular form of psychological suffering that is almost invisible to ordinary consciousness. It manifests as chronic dissatisfaction with the present moment because the present never contains the fully realized identity that craving is seeking to establish. You are always becoming, but never quite arriving at some imagined state of complete selfhood. This creates a persistent sense that real life is always just ahead, that satisfaction will come when you finally become who you are meant to be. The third type, vibhava-tanha, is craving for non-existence or annihilation. This is perhaps the most subtle and therefore most dangerous form of craving because it often masquerades as wisdom or spiritual insight. It manifests as the desire to escape from the difficulties of conscious existence through various forms of numbing, avoiding, or checking out. The wish that problems would simply disappear, that difficult emotions would stop arising, that challenging circumstances would magically resolve themselves without any effort on your part. This type of craving can manifest in obvious ways like substance abuse, compulsive entertainment consumption, or workaholism as a form of avoidance. But it also shows up in sophisticated forms that can fool even experienced practitioners. The spiritual seeker who wants to transcend human concerns rather than engage with them skillfully. The meditation student who uses mindfulness techniques to suppress difficult emotions rather than understand them. The philosopher who retreats into abstract thinking to avoid the messiness of actual relationships and responsibilities. The Buddha's analysis revealed that all three types of craving share a common underlying structure. They all involve consciousness projecting its sense of well-being onto something other than present moment awareness itself. Whether seeking pleasure, seeking to become something, or seeking to escape, the mind is constantly looking elsewhere for what can only be found in the quality of awareness itself. This creates a perpetual state of psychological displacement, a constant sense of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the Buddha's investigation went even deeper into the mechanics of how craving operates in real time. He identified a precise sequence of mental events that occurs thousands of times per day, usually below the threshold of conscious recognition. This sequence begins when one of the six senses makes contact with an object. The eye sees a colour, the ear hears a sound, the mind encounters a thought or memory. This contact immediately triggers a feeling tone, either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. This feeling tone happens automatically and is not yet problematic. The problem arises in what happens next. Based on the feeling tone, craving arises automatically in one of its three forms. If the contact is pleasant, craving for sensual pleasure arises, seeking to repeat or intensify the experience. If the contact threatens the ego structure, craving for existence arises, seeking to defend or expand the sense of self. If the contact is unpleasant or overwhelming, craving for non-existence arises, seeking to avoid or escape the experience. This entire sequence happens in milliseconds and usually passes completely unnoticed. Once craving has arisen, it immediately triggers what the Buddha called upadana, usually translated as clinging or grasping. This is where craving moves from a mental impulse to an active attempt to manipulate experience. Clinging manifests as mental commentary about the experience, stories about what it means, plans for how to get more of it or get rid of it, comparisons with past experiences, projections about future consequences. The mind becomes completely absorbed in these secondary mental activities and loses contact with the direct experience that started the whole sequence. The Buddha identified 4 specific types of clinging that arise from the 3 types of craving. Clinging to sensual pleasures, which includes not just physical desires, but the entire range of ways the mind grasps after pleasant experiences. Clinging to views and opinions, which includes both philosophical beliefs and everyday judgments about how things should be. Clinging to rules and practices, which includes rigid adherence to moral codes, spiritual techniques, or behavioral patterns. And clinging to theories of selfhood, which includes all the ways the mind tries to establish and maintain a solid sense of personal identity. These 4 types of clinging work together to create what the Buddha called the wheel of becoming, a self-perpetuating cycle that keeps consciousness trapped in patterns of seeking and dissatisfaction. Each act of clinging creates karma, intentional actions that shape future experiences. These karmic formations then influence how consciousness encounters new experiences, predisposing it to certain types of craving and clinging. This creates a feedback loop where past clinging influences present perception, which triggers new craving, which creates new clinging, which influences future perception, and so on indefinitely. The Buddha's analysis also revealed why attempts to satisfy craving through getting what you want are ultimately futile. Craving is not actually about the objects it seems to seek. It is about consciousness's attempt to establish a sense of security and completeness through controlling experience. But experience by its very nature cannot be controlled because it is constantly changing. This means that craving is structurally designed to fail, like trying to grasp water with your hands or pin down a shadow. The harder you try, the more elusive satisfaction becomes. Even more problematically, every act of craving strengthens the neural pathways and mental habits that generate more craving. Indulging sensual desires increases sensual desire. Fighting to maintain or improve your self-image increases identification with that self-image. Avoiding difficult experiences increases the fear of difficult experiences. Craving literally feeds on itself, growing stronger through both satisfaction and frustration. This is why people can achieve everything they thought they wanted and still feel fundamentally dissatisfied. The second noble truth concludes with a radical reframe of what it means to take responsibility for your own experience. Most therapeutic and spiritual approaches focus on changing external circumstances, processing past traumas, or developing better coping strategies. The Buddha's approach focuses instead on understanding the precise moment-to-moment mechanics through which consciousness creates its own suffering. This shifts attention from what is happening to how you are relating to what is happening. It reveals that freedom lies not in getting the right experiences, but in discovering a way of engaging with any experience that does not depend on that experience being different than it is. Part 3. The promise of complete liberation. The third noble truth represents the most audacious claim in the history of human psychology. The suffering that seems so inevitable, so woven into the fabric of conscious existence, can actually end completely. Not temporarily, not partially, not through achieving perfect external circumstances, but through a fundamental transformation in the very structure of how consciousness operates. This state of complete liberation is called nirvana, a word that has been so misunderstood in popular culture that its original meaning has been almost completely obscured. Nirvana literally means extinguishing or blowing out, like a candle flame being extinguished by a gentle breath. What gets extinguished is not consciousness itself, but the compulsive mental processes that keep consciousness trapped in cycles of craving and dissatisfaction. This is not unconsciousness, not emotional numbness, not withdrawal from life. It is consciousness freed from the psychological mechanisms that create suffering, operating with complete clarity and responsiveness, but without the desperate edge of needing things to be different than they are. The Buddha's description of nirvana challenges virtually every assumption that ordinary consciousness makes about what constitutes a fulfilling life. It is described as the unconditioned, meaning it does not depend on any particular circumstances being present or absent. It is called the deathless, not because the body becomes immortal, but because the sense of psychological death that comes from constant becoming and unbecoming has ended. It is referred to as the ultimate security, not because external threats disappear, but because the internal vulnerability that makes threats threatening has been resolved. But the Buddha's analysis of liberation goes far beyond poetic descriptions into precise psychological territory. He identified exactly what changes when consciousness is freed from the mechanisms of craving and exactly what remains unchanged. The six senses continue to operate normally, bringing information about sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and mental phenomena. Pleasant and unpleasant feeling tones continue to arise in response to sensory contact. The body continues to have its needs, preferences continue to exist, practical decisions still need to be made. What disappears is the compulsive reactivity that usually follows these natural processes. In the liberated consciousness, pleasant experiences are appreciated without grasping, unpleasant experiences are acknowledged without resistance, and neutral experiences are met with equanimity. Preferences exist, but they remain light and workable rather than becoming sources of psychological suffering. You can want something without needing it for your emotional survival. You can dislike something without being driven to change it. You can engage fully with whatever circumstances arise without your well-being depending on those circumstances being different than they are. The Buddha described this transformation through a series of profound metaphors that reveal different aspects of what liberation actually entails. Nirvana is like a fire that has gone out, not because it has been violently extinguished, but because it has consumed all available fuel. The fuel of suffering is craving, and when craving ends naturally through understanding rather than suppression, the fire of suffering simply goes out by itself. There is no violence in this process, no forcing, no struggle against natural mental processes. It is more like watching a fever break than like winning a battle. Nirvana is also described as crossing to the further shore of a great river. The near shore represents ordinary consciousness trapped in cycles of seeking and dissatisfaction. The far shore represents consciousness freed from these cycles. The river itself represents the spiritual path, the systematic process of training that makes this crossing possible. Once you have crossed, you do not need to carry the raft that brought you across, but neither do you forget the skills you developed in the crossing. Liberation includes and transcends the path that led to it. Perhaps most importantly, nirvana is described as the cessation of becoming. This points to the ending of consciousness's compulsive drive to establish and maintain a sense of separate selfhood. In ordinary awareness, tremendous psychological energy is constantly devoted to defending, improving, and projecting the ego structure. Mental conversations run continuously about who you are, how you compare to others, what you need to do to maintain your identity, how to get others to see you the way you want to be seen. In liberated consciousness, this entire self-maintenance project simply stops operating. Energy that was previously bound up in self-concern becomes available for direct engagement with reality as it actually is. The Buddha's analysis revealed that liberation occurs through understanding rather than through achievement. You do not become liberated by acquiring something new, but by seeing through something that was never actually there in the first place. The separate self that seems so solid and important is revealed to be a construction, a process rather than a thing, a verb rather than a noun. When this construction is seen clearly, it does not need to be destroyed or transcended. It simply stops being a problem because it is recognized as having been a misunderstanding all along. This insight into the constructed nature of selfhood represents one of the Buddha's most radical departures from other spiritual traditions. Most mystical paths involve some form of union, merger, or identification with a larger cosmic reality. The Buddhist path involves seeing that the entity that would unite with something larger never existed as a separate thing in the first place. There is no one to be liberated because liberation is precisely the recognition that the one who seemed to need liberating was a case of mistaken identity. But this recognition does not lead to nihilism or meaninglessness. Instead, it reveals the natural compassion and wisdom that were always present but obscured by the self-maintenance project. When consciousness is no longer primarily concerned with defending and improving a separate identity, it becomes naturally responsive to the suffering and well-being of all sentient beings. Ethics becomes spontaneous rather than effortful, wisdom becomes natural rather than acquired. Love becomes unconditional rather than strategic. The Buddha also addressed the question of whether liberation is permanent or temporary. He distinguished between different levels of realization, some temporary and some irreversible. Temporary states of liberation can occur during meditation or in moments of profound insight, giving practitioners a taste of what is possible. But complete liberation involves a fundamental rewiring of consciousness that cannot be undone once it has occurred. This is not because the liberated person becomes perfect or infallible, but because they have seen through the basic misunderstanding that creates suffering so clearly that they cannot unsee it. The irreversible nature of complete liberation is compared to the impossibility of believing that a rope is a snake once you have seen clearly that it is just a rope. You might still have momentary startled reactions if you encounter the rope unexpectedly in dim light, but these reactions no longer carry the weight of genuine belief. Similarly, the liberated consciousness might still have momentary preferences, emotional reactions, or physical discomforts, but these no longer create the secondary suffering that comes from resistance and craving. They are experienced as natural phenomena arising and passing in awareness rather than as problems that require solving. The Buddha's teaching on liberation also addresses what happens to motivation and engagement with life after the driving force of craving has ended. Many people assume that without the energy of desire, life would become flat, boring, or purposeless. But the Buddha's description suggests exactly the opposite. When consciousness is no longer bound up in the project of self-maintenance, it becomes available for much more creative and spontaneous engagement with whatever circumstances arise. Actions arise from wisdom and compassion rather than from compulsion and neediness, making them far more effective and satisfying. The third noble truth concludes with the recognition that liberation is not a reward for good behavior or a gift from external forces, but the natural result of understanding how suffering is created and systematically removing its causes. This makes the entire Buddhist path fundamentally empirical rather than faith-based. Every step can be verified through direct experience. Every insight can be tested through practical application. Every claim can be investigated through careful observation of your own mind. Liberation is not something you hope for in the future, but something you can glimpse and develop in the present moment through understanding what is actually happening in consciousness right now. Part 4. The technology of transformation. The fourth noble truth presents the most sophisticated system of psychological training ever developed, a comprehensive methodology for transforming consciousness that has been tested and refined across 25 centuries of practical application. This is called the Noble Eightfold Path, though the word path can be misleading in English because it suggests a linear progression from point A to point B. In reality, these 8 factors represent different aspects of a single, integrated way of living, each supporting and being supported by all the others. Together they constitute what might be called a technology of liberation, a precise set of tools for working skillfully with the mind. The 8 factors are traditionally organized into 3 groups that address different dimensions of human experience. The wisdom group includes right understanding and right intention, which provide the intellectual and motivational foundation for the entire path. The ethical conduct group includes right speech, right action, and right livelihood, which create the behavioral conditions necessary for deep psychological work. The mental cultivation group includes right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration, which directly train consciousness itself. But these divisions are artificial conveniences for teaching purposes. In actual practice, all 8 factors develop simultaneously and interdependently. Right understanding, the first factor, involves developing accurate knowledge about the nature of reality, particularly the 4 noble truths and their implications. But this is not merely intellectual understanding like memorizing facts for a test. Right understanding means seeing directly how suffering is created through your own mental processes, recognizing the impermanent nature of all conditioned phenomena, and understanding the constructed nature of personal identity. This level of understanding can only be developed through sustained investigation of your own experience, combined with careful study of those who have walked this path before. The development of right understanding typically progresses through several stages. It begins with theoretical knowledge, learning the basic framework of Buddhist psychology through study and reflection. This theoretical foundation then needs to be verified through direct observation of your own mental processes. You begin to notice how craving actually operates in real time, how attachment creates vulnerability, how identification with thoughts and emotions creates suffering. Eventually, if practice is sustained, this understanding becomes intuitive and immediate rather than requiring conscious analysis. You simply see reality clearly without needing to think about what you're seeing. Right intention, the second factor, involves cultivating the proper motivation for engaging in this work. The Buddha identified 3 specific intentions that support liberation: renunciation, goodwill, and harmlessness. Renunciation does not mean rejecting the world, but developing the wisdom to distinguish between what is actually worth pursuing and what only appears to be worth pursuing. It means recognizing that true satisfaction cannot be found through accumulating experiences, achievements, or external validation. This recognition naturally leads to a simplification of desires and a focus on what genuinely contributes to well-being. Goodwill involves cultivating genuine care for the welfare of all beings, including yourself. This is not manufactured kindness or moral obligation, but the natural result of understanding how interconnected everything is. When you see clearly that your well-being and the well-being of others are intimately connected, caring for others becomes a form of enlightened self-interest. Harmlessness flows naturally from goodwill, manifesting as the intention to avoid actions that cause unnecessary suffering to yourself or others. This includes obvious forms of harm like violence and deception, but also subtle forms like gossip, manipulation, and passive aggression. Right speech, the third factor, addresses how you use language both externally and internally. External right speech involves avoiding lying, harsh language, gossip, and idle chatter, while cultivating truthfulness, kindness, meaningful communication, and helpful silence. But the Buddha's analysis goes much deeper into how speech affects consciousness itself. Every word you speak reinforces certain neural pathways and mental habits. Complaining strengthens the tendency to focus on problems. Gossiping increases preoccupation with other people's business. Harsh speech increases anger and defensiveness. Conversely, speaking truthfully strengthens clarity, speaking kindly increases compassion, speaking meaningfully develops wisdom. Internal right speech, the quality of your mental commentary, may be even more important than external speech. The average human mind generates thousands of words per day in the form of internal dialogue, judgment, planning, and commentary. This internal speech shapes your perception of reality moment by moment, creating the lens through which you interpret everything that happens. Learning to observe and gradually refine your internal speech patterns is one of the most practical aspects of the Buddhist path. This does not mean suppressing thoughts, but developing the ability to recognize unhelpful mental commentary and gently redirect attention toward more skillful ways of relating to experience. Right action, the fourth factor, involves aligning your behavior with wisdom and compassion. The Buddha identified specific actions to avoid: killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, intoxication, and lying. But right action goes far beyond following rules to include developing sensitivity to the consequences of all your behaviors. Every action creates karmic results, shaping both your internal mental states and your external circumstances. Right action means choosing behaviors that support greater freedom, wisdom, and compassion, while avoiding behaviors that increase suffering, confusion, and selfishness. The practice of right action requires developing what might be called ethical sensitivity, the ability to sense the subtle effects of your choices on your own consciousness and on the well-being of others. This sensitivity develops gradually through careful attention to the results of different types of behavior. You begin to notice how certain actions leave you feeling more peaceful and clear, while others create agitation and confusion. You observe how your behavior affects the people around you, how kindness and generosity create positive responses, while selfishness and aggression create negative ones. Over time, ethical behavior becomes natural and spontaneous rather than effortful because you directly perceive its benefits. Right livelihood, the fifth factor, extends right action into the realm of how you earn your living and organize your economic life. The Buddha specifically mentioned avoiding livelihoods that involve harming living beings, such as trading in weapons, living beings, meat, intoxicants, and poison. But the principle applies more broadly to any way of earning money that requires you to act against your deeper values or that contributes significantly to the suffering of others. Right livelihood also includes developing a healthy relationship with money and material possessions, neither clinging to wealth nor rejecting it entirely. The practice of right livelihood often requires difficult choices about balancing idealism with practical necessity. Few people in modern society have the luxury of earning money in ways that are completely aligned with Buddhist principles. The goal is not perfection, but continuous movement in the direction of greater integrity and less harm. This might involve changing careers gradually, modifying how you approach your current work, or simply becoming more conscious of the ethical dimensions of your economic choices. Right livelihood is ultimately about recognizing that how you earn and spend money is inseparable from your spiritual development. Right effort, the sixth factor, addresses the quality of energy you bring to spiritual practice and to life in general. This is not about forcing yourself to be disciplined or pushing through resistance with willpower. Right effort involves learning to work with mental energy skillfully, applying just the right amount of intensity for each situation. Too little effort, and you remain stuck in old patterns. Too much effort, and you create tension and resistance. The Buddha compared right effort to tuning a stringed instrument, finding the precise tension that allows the instrument to produce beautiful music. The Buddha identified 4 specific applications of right effort. First, the effort to prevent unwholesome mental states from arising by maintaining awareness and avoiding situations that trigger harmful patterns. Second, the effort to abandon unwholesome mental states that have already arisen by neither suppressing them nor indulging them, but understanding them clearly until they naturally dissolve. Third, the effort to cultivate wholesome mental states that have not yet arisen by creating conditions that support wisdom, compassion, and peace. Fourth, the effort to maintain and develop wholesome mental states that are already present by appreciating them and providing the conditions they need to flourish. Right mindfulness, the 7th factor, involves developing the capacity to observe the mind without being caught up in its contents. This is perhaps the most distinctive aspect of Buddhist practice, and the one that has had the greatest influence on modern psychology and neuroscience. Mindfulness is not relaxation, though it can be relaxing. It is not positive thinking, though it can improve your mood. Mindfulness is a specific mental skill, the ability to maintain clear awareness of present-moment experience without getting lost in stories, judgments, or reactions about that experience. The Buddha identified 4 foundations of mindfulness that provide a complete framework for training attention. Mindfulness of the body includes awareness of breath, posture, physical sensations, and bodily activities. This foundation grounds awareness in immediate physical reality and provides a stable reference point when the mind becomes agitated or confused. Mindfulness of feelings involves recognizing the pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral feeling tone that accompanies every moment of experience. This foundation helps you catch the arising of craving before it becomes full-blown clinging. Mindfulness of mind involves observing mental states and emotional patterns without being identified with them. You learn to recognize anger without becoming angry, to notice fear without being afraid, to observe desire without being driven by it. This creates tremendous psychological freedom because you are no longer at the mercy of whatever emotional weather happens to be passing through consciousness. Mindfulness of phenomena involves observing how all experiences arise and pass away according to natural laws rather than according to personal preference. This foundation develops deep acceptance of the way things actually are rather than the way you want them to be. Right concentration, the 8th factor, involves training the mind to rest in states of profound stability and clarity. This is not about spacing out or becoming unconscious, but about developing the capacity to sustain attention on a single object for extended periods without distraction or dullness. The Buddha described a series of increasingly refined concentrative states called jhanas, each characterized by specific qualities of peace, joy, and mental unification. These states are not ends in themselves, but powerful tools for developing insight and understanding. The cultivation of concentration typically begins with focusing attention on a simple object like the breath or a visual image. At first, the mind wanders constantly, and maintaining focus for even a few seconds requires considerable effort. Gradually, with consistent practice, the mind becomes more stable and attention more refined. As concentration deepens, you begin to experience states of profound peace and clarity that reveal the natural potential of consciousness when it is not scattered and agitated. These concentrated states provide both a refuge from the chaos of ordinary mental activity and a platform for investigating the nature of reality with unprecedented clarity. The Noble Eightfold Path represents a complete education in human consciousness, addressing every aspect of mental, emotional, and behavioral functioning. Unlike many spiritual systems that focus primarily on beliefs or practices, Buddhism provides practical methods for transforming the entire structure of how you relate to experience. The path is simultaneously profound enough to occupy a lifetime of investigation and practical enough to provide immediate benefits for anyone willing to experiment with its methods. Most importantly, every aspect of the path can be verified through direct experience, making Buddhism fundamentally empirical rather than faith-based. Part 5. The Mirage of Personal Identity. Perhaps no aspect of Buddhist psychology is more revolutionary or more difficult to grasp than its analysis of personal identity. What you take to be yourself, the sense of being a continuous, separate entity moving through time, is revealed to be a construction, a process rather than a thing, a verb rather than a noun. This insight, called anatta or not-self, represents one of the Buddha's most original contributions to human understanding, and one of the most practically transformative recognitions available to consciousness. It does not mean you do not exist, but that you exist very differently than you imagine you do. The Buddha's investigation into the nature of selfhood began with a simple but profound question. If there is a self, where exactly is it? This is not a philosophical question, but an empirical investigation that anyone can conduct. When you look for this self that seems so obvious and important, what do you actually find? Is it in your body? Your body is constantly changing, replacing nearly all its cells every 7 years, yet you maintain a sense of being the same person. Is the self in your thoughts? Thoughts arise and disappear constantly, and the content of your thinking changes dramatically depending on circumstances, yet something seems to remain constant. Perhaps the self is in your emotions or personality traits, but these too are constantly shifting depending on your mood, health, social situation, and life experiences. The person you are when tired is different from the person you are when well rested. The person you are with your family is different from the person you are with strangers. The person you were 10 years ago had different opinions, preferences and concerns than the person you are today. Yet through all these changes, something maintains the sense of being a continuous identity. What is this something, and where exactly can it be found? The Buddha's analysis revealed that what we call the self is actually a dynamic process involving 5 constantly changing components called the 5 aggregates. These aggregates are form, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. Form includes the physical body and all material aspects of existence. Sensation refers to the immediate feeling tone that arises when consciousness makes contact with any object through the 6 senses. Perception involves the recognition and interpretation of sensory and mental data. Mental formations include all the complex mental processes like thoughts, emotions, intentions, and psychological patterns. Consciousness refers to the basic knowing quality that makes experience possible. These 5 aggregates are constantly arising, changing, and dissolving in response to conditions. In every moment, millions of microprocesses are occurring as the aggregates interact with each other and with environmental conditions. What creates the illusion of a separate, continuous self is the mind's tendency to create a story of coherence and permanence out of this constant flux. It is like watching a movie and forgetting that what appears to be smooth motion is actually thousands of still frames projected in rapid sequence. The sense of being a solid, continuous self is a perceptual construction, not a fundamental reality. But the Buddha's analysis goes even deeper into the mechanics of how this construction occurs. He identified a specific psychological process that operates continuously to maintain the illusion of selfhood. This process involves consciousness constantly identifying with whatever is arising in awareness and claiming it as me or mine. When a thought arises, there is an immediate sense that this is my thought. When an emotion appears, it becomes my emotion. When a sensation occurs, it is experienced as happening to me. This constant process of identification and appropriation creates the sense of being a central owner of experience. The problem with this identification process is that it creates a fundamental contradiction at the heart of consciousness. You identify with things that are constantly changing as if they were permanent. You claim ownership of processes that are actually impersonal. You treat conditioned phenomena as if they constituted an unconditioned self. This creates a persistent sense of insecurity because you are trying to build a stable identity out of inherently unstable materials. It is like trying to construct a solid building on quicksand or create a permanent sculpture out of flowing water. The harder you try to solidify the sense of self, the more unstable and anxiety-provoking it becomes. The Buddha used a powerful analogy to illustrate this predicament. Imagine trying to grasp water with your hands. The tighter you squeeze, the more water escapes between your fingers. The same is true with the attempt to establish a solid sense of personal identity. The more desperately consciousness grasps after selfhood, the more elusive and problematic that selfhood becomes. This is why people can have everything they thought they needed to be happy and still feel fundamentally insecure. The problem is not with what they have or lack, but with the entire project of trying to create security through identification with changing conditions. The recognition of not-self does not happen through philosophical reasoning alone, though intellectual understanding can prepare the ground. It typically occurs through sustained meditative investigation that reveals the constructed nature of personal identity through direct observation. As mindfulness develops, you begin to notice the constant process of identification that usually operates below the threshold of awareness. You catch the mind in the act of claiming ownership of experiences, of creating stories about who you are based on temporary mental states, of defending and maintaining a sense of separate selfhood. Initially, this recognition can be quite disturbing because it challenges the most fundamental assumption of ordinary consciousness. If there is no solid self, then who is having these experiences? Who is making decisions? Who is responsible for actions? Who is practicing the spiritual path? These questions point to the need for a complete reframe of what it means to be conscious. Experience continues to occur, but it is no longer centered around a separate experiencer. Decisions continue to be made, but they arise from the totality of conditions rather than from a central decision-maker. Responsibility continues to exist, but it is distributed throughout the web of interdependent causation rather than concentrated in an individual entity. The Buddha addressed these concerns by distinguishing between conventional truth and ultimate truth. Conventionally, it is perfectly appropriate to use language like I and you, mine and yours, self and other. These distinctions are useful for practical purposes like communication, social organization, and moral responsibility. But ultimately, these conventional designations do not point to solid, separate entities. They are practical conveniences, like the lines of longitude and latitude that help us navigate the globe, but do not actually exist as physical markings on the Earth. Understanding this distinction allows you to function effectively in the conventional world, while maintaining awareness of the deeper truth of interconnectedness and impermanence. The practical implications of understanding not-self are profound and liberating. Most psychological suffering comes from defending, maintaining and enhancing a sense of separate selfhood. When this selfhood is recognized as a construction rather than a reality, tremendous psychological energy becomes available for more creative and compassionate engagement with life. You can have preferences without being imprisoned by them, opinions without needing others to agree with them, experiences without being defined by them. The defensive reactivity that characterizes so much human interaction begins to relax because there is less sense of a separate self that needs defending. The recognition of not-self also transforms the entire motivation for spiritual practice. Instead of seeking to improve or transcend yourself, you begin to see through the self that seemed to need improving or transcending. Instead of trying to achieve some future state of enlightenment, you recognize that the one who would achieve enlightenment is part of the problem that needs to be understood. Practice becomes less about becoming someone better and more about seeing through the illusion of being someone at all. This shift in motivation makes the path both more humble and more profound. The Buddha's teaching on not-self also reveals why compassion arises naturally as wisdom develops. When the barriers between self and other are seen to be conceptual constructions rather than fundamental realities, caring for others becomes as natural as caring for yourself. The suffering of other beings is no longer experienced as happening to someone else, but as arising within the same field of interdependent awareness that includes what you conventionally call your own experience. This recognition transforms ethics from a set of imposed rules to a spontaneous expression of understanding. Understanding not-self also provides a completely different perspective on death and impermanence. If there is no solid, continuous self to begin with, then there is nothing solid or continuous that can be lost through death. What dies is a particular configuration of the 5 aggregates, but the aggregates themselves continue in new forms according to the law of cause and effect. This does not necessarily imply personal survival after death, but it does suggest that the sharp distinction between existence and non-existence that terrifies ordinary consciousness is based on a fundamental misunderstanding. Death becomes not the annihilation of a self, but the dissolution of a temporary pattern in the ongoing flow of natural processes. Part 6. The river of constant change. Everything that exists is in constant flux, arising and passing away with every moment, never remaining the same from one instant to the next. This insight into universal impermanence, called anicca in the original language, represents one of the Buddha's most fundamental observations about the nature of reality. Yet despite its obviousness when pointed out, impermanence remains one of the most difficult truths for consciousness to fully accept and integrate. The mind's resistance to acknowledging constant change creates much of the suffering that characterizes ordinary human experience. The Buddha's investigation into impermanence began with careful observation of his own direct experience. Every breath has a beginning, middle, and end. Every thought arises from nothing, exists for a brief moment and dissolves back into nothing. Every emotion has an identifiable arising, a period of intensity, and a natural dissolution. Every physical sensation appears, changes quality and intensity, and eventually disappears. Even the most persistent mental states, like depression or chronic anxiety, are actually composed of countless micro-moments of arising and passing away when observed with sufficient precision. This universal characteristic of arising and passing away applies not just to obvious things like thoughts and emotions, but to everything that can be experienced. Your sense of personal identity changes constantly as new experiences modify your self-concept and old memories fade or transform. Your relationships evolve continuously as both you and others change in response to circumstances and inner development. Your beliefs and opinions shift over time as new information and experiences challenge old assumptions. Even your physical body is in constant flux, with cells dying and being born, chemical processes creating and breaking down molecules, energy flowing in and out continuously. But the Buddha's analysis of impermanence goes much deeper than simply observing that things change over time. He recognized that what appears to be continuous existence is actually composed of countless discrete moments of arising and dissolution happening with extraordinary rapidity. What you experience as a solid table is actually billions of atoms vibrating in space, constantly exchanging energy with their environment. What you experience as a continuous stream of consciousness is actually millions of micro-moments of knowing arising and passing away in rapid succession. Reality at the deepest level is more like a strobe light than a steady flame, more like a movie than a still photograph. This insight into the moment-to-moment nature of existence has profound implications for understanding how suffering is created and how it can be resolved. Most psychological pain comes from consciousness trying to make permanent what is inherently impermanent. You want pleasurable experiences to last forever. You want painful experiences to end immediately. You want your sense of identity to remain stable and secure. But the very nature of existence makes these desires impossible to fulfill. Trying to stop change is like trying to stop a river from flowing or prevent the sun from setting. The effort itself creates tension and frustration while accomplishing nothing. The Buddha identified 3 specific ways that resistance to impermanence creates suffering. The first is obvious. Clinging to pleasant experiences that are naturally ending creates the pain of loss and separation. The joy of falling in love is shadowed by the fear of losing that love. The pleasure of success is diminished by anxiety about maintaining that success. The satisfaction of achievement is complicated by worry about future failures. This type of suffering is widely recognized, though not usually understood as a problem with impermanence rather than with particular circumstances. The second way is more subtle. Resisting unpleasant experiences that are naturally arising creates additional layers of suffering beyond the original discomfort. Physical pain becomes emotional anguish when accompanied by thoughts like "this should not be happening" or "when will this end?" Difficult emotions like sadness or fear become psychological problems when consciousness fights against them rather than allowing them to follow their natural course of arising and dissolving. The resistance creates tension, the tension creates more resistance, and what might have been a brief passing cloud becomes a persistent storm. The third way is the most subtle and therefore the most pervasive. The constant background anxiety that comes from existing as a conscious being in a world where nothing remains stable. Even when things are going well, there is an underlying sense of insecurity because consciousness knows intuitively that current conditions will not last. This creates a persistent feeling of walking on thin ice, never being able to fully relax because change could occur at any moment. This type of suffering is so fundamental to ordinary consciousness that most people mistake it for a basic fact of existence rather than recognizing it as the result of resistance to the natural flow of change. The Buddha's approach to working with impermanence is neither resignation nor denial, but what might be called radical acceptance. This means learning to align consciousness with the natural flow of change rather than fighting against it. Radical acceptance does not mean becoming passive or fatalistic, but developing the wisdom to distinguish between what can be skillfully influenced and what must be allowed to follow its natural course. You can make efforts to create conditions that support your well-being, but you cannot control the outcomes of those efforts because outcomes depend on countless factors beyond your influence. The practice of accepting impermanence typically develops through stages. Initially, there is intellectual acknowledgement that things change, but little emotional integration of this understanding. You know that pleasant experiences will end, but you still suffer when they do. You understand that difficult times will pass, but you still resist them when they arise. This stage is important because it provides the conceptual framework for deeper investigation, but it does not yet transform the basic patterns of clinging and resistance. The next stage involves beginning to observe the process of change directly through meditative awareness. You start to notice the constant arising and passing of thoughts, emotions, and sensations in real time. This direct observation gradually weakens the illusion that experiences are solid and permanent, making it easier to let go when change occurs. You begin to develop what might be called change readiness, a quality of mental flexibility that allows you to adjust more quickly to new circumstances rather than remaining stuck in how things used to be. The deepest stage of integration involves discovering that impermanence is not a problem to be solved, but the very nature of life itself. Change becomes a source of freedom rather than anxiety, because it means that no difficult situation is permanent and no pleasant situation needs to be clung to desperately. You begin to appreciate the freshness and creativity that constant change makes possible, recognizing that a world without impermanence would be static, boring, and ultimately lifeless. The very qualities that make existence meaningful, such as growth, learning, and development, depend entirely on the fact that nothing remains the same. This transformed relationship with impermanence has immediate practical benefits. Decision-making becomes less anxious because you understand that no decision is permanent and mistakes can be corrected as new information becomes available. Relationships become less possessive because you appreciate people as they are in each moment rather than trying to freeze them into fixed roles or expectations. Planning for the future becomes more flexible because you hold your goals lightly, willing to adjust them as circumstances change. Even aging and physical decline become easier to accept because they are recognized as natural expressions of the universal process of change rather than personal failures or cosmic injustices. The Buddha also used the understanding of impermanence as a tool for working with difficult mental states. When experiencing strong emotions like anger, fear, or sadness, remembering that these states are impermanent can provide immediate relief from their intensity. Instead of getting caught up in the story about why you are feeling this way or what needs to be done about it, you can simply observe the emotion arising, changing, and eventually dissolving on its own. This does not mean suppressing emotions or pretending they do not matter, but recognizing their temporary nature and allowing them space to follow their natural course. The insight into impermanence also transforms the entire approach to spiritual practice. Instead of seeking permanent states of peace or enlightenment, you begin to appreciate the dynamic quality of awakened consciousness. Wisdom is not a fixed achievement, but a flowing response to changing conditions. Compassion is not a permanent emotional state, but a continuous adjustment to the suffering around you. Liberation is not a final destination, but an ongoing process of letting go. This understanding makes the path both more humble and more sustainable, because it removes the pressure to achieve some imagined state of perfection. Understanding impermanence deeply also reveals the interconnected nature of all phenomena. Nothing changes in isolation because everything exists in relationship with everything else. When you change, your relationships change. When your relationships change, the people around you change. When they change, their relationships change, and the effects ripple outward indefinitely. This recognition makes you more conscious of how your thoughts, words, and actions contribute to the constantly changing web of existence, increasing your sense of responsibility while simultaneously reducing the weight of that responsibility by distributing it throughout the entire network of interdependence. Part 7. The Web Without a Weaver. Nothing exists independently. This statement represents perhaps the most profound and far-reaching insight in Buddhist philosophy, one that challenges the deepest assumptions of ordinary consciousness about the nature of reality. Called pratitya samutpada, or dependent origination, this principle reveals that everything arises in dependence upon conditions, exists only in relationship, and dissolves when those conditions change. Understanding this interconnectedness transforms not just how you see the world, but how you see yourself and your place in the vast web of existence. The Buddha's investigation into interdependence began with a simple but revolutionary question. How do things come into existence? Most people assume that objects and experiences exist independently and then interact with other independent objects and experiences. The Buddha's careful observation revealed exactly the opposite. Things do not exist first and then relate, but rather come into existence through relationship itself. Nothing has inherent independent existence because everything depends on causes and conditions for its arising, maintenance, and dissolution. Consider something as simple as the experience of seeing a tree. This experience requires the presence of a tree, functioning eyes, adequate lighting, a nervous system capable of processing visual information, previous experiences that allow you to recognize the patterns of light and shadow as a tree, and countless other conditions. Remove any of these conditions, and the experience of seeing a tree cannot occur. The experience does not exist independently and then encounter these conditions, but comes into existence precisely through the coming together of these conditions. When the conditions change or disappear, the experience changes or disappears as well. This same principle applies to everything that can be experienced, including mental states, emotions, and even the sense of personal identity. Anger does not exist as a thing somewhere in your mind waiting to be triggered. It arises when specific conditions come together. A triggering event, a story about what that event means, physical tension in the body, memories of similar situations, and various other psychological and environmental factors. Change any of these conditions, and the anger changes or disappears entirely. The anger has no existence apart from these interdependent conditions. The Buddha formulated this insight into what is called the principle of dependent origination. This arising that arises, this ceasing that ceases. This principle operates at every level of existence, from the most obvious physical processes to the most subtle psychological phenomena. Seeds sprout when they encounter the right conditions of soil, moisture, temperature, and light. Thoughts arise when consciousness encounters objects through the six senses in the presence of attention and memory. Suffering appears when craving meets impermanence in the context of identification with changing conditions. Liberation occurs when wisdom encounters craving in the presence of sustained mindful investigation. The traditional teaching presents dependent origination through a 12-link chain that describes how suffering perpetuates itself through cycles of conditioned existence. This chain begins with fundamental ignorance about the nature of reality, particularly ignorance about impermanence, suffering, and the constructed nature of selfhood. This ignorance creates karmic formations, intentional actions based on misunderstanding that shape future experiences. These formations condition consciousness, which conditions name and form, which conditions the six sense spheres, which conditions contact, which conditions feeling, which conditions craving, which conditions clinging, which conditions becoming, which conditions birth, which conditions aging and death. While this traditional formulation can seem abstract, it describes psychological processes that occur thousands of times per day. Every moment of unconscious reactivity strengthens mental patterns that shape how you perceive and respond to future situations. Every act of craving reinforces the neural pathways that generate more craving. Every moment of resistance increases the tendency toward resistance. Every instance of identification with thoughts and emotions makes that identification more automatic and compelling. Suffering perpetuates itself through these feedback loops of conditioned response. But the same principle that explains how suffering perpetuates also reveals how it can be interrupted and ultimately ended. When ignorance is replaced by understanding, the entire chain of conditioning begins to transform. When you see clearly how mental states arise in dependence upon conditions, you can begin working skillfully with those conditions rather than being at their mercy. When you understand how craving creates clinging, you can catch the process earlier in its development before it becomes overwhelming. When you recognize how identification creates suffering, you can learn to hold experiences more lightly. The insight into interdependence also reveals why individual liberation is inseparable from universal liberation. Since nothing exists independently, your well-being and the well-being of all other beings are intimately interconnected. Your mental states affect everyone you encounter. Their responses affect their other relationships, and the effects ripple outward throughout the entire web of existence. Conversely, the suffering and joy of others affects you directly through the same networks of interdependence. This recognition makes compassion not just a moral choice, but an acknowledgement of factual reality. Understanding interdependence transforms the entire notion of personal responsibility. You are neither completely responsible for everything that happens to you, nor completely powerless in the face of external circumstances. Your actions and mental states influence the conditions you encounter, but those conditions also shape your capacity to respond skillfully. You are both the creator and the product of your circumstances, both the cause and the effect of your experience. This recognition leads to what might be called participatory responsibility, taking full ownership of your part in the web of causation while acknowledging that your part is always embedded within larger patterns beyond your control. The principle of interdependence also provides a sophisticated understanding of how change occurs in complex systems. Most people assume that change happens through direct, linear causation. You decide to do something different, and the results follow immediately. The Buddha's analysis reveals that change actually occurs through the gradual shifting of multiple interconnected conditions, often in ways that are not immediately visible. Small consistent changes in one area of life can eventually transform the entire system, while dramatic changes that ignore interdependent conditions often prove unsustainable. This understanding has immediate practical applications for spiritual practice and personal development. Instead of trying to force yourself to change through willpower alone, you learn to create conditions that naturally support the changes you want to see. If you want to develop greater patience, you work simultaneously with your thoughts, emotions, physical tension, environmental factors, and social relationships, rather than just trying to suppress impatient reactions. If you want to cultivate compassion, you investigate the conditions that open your heart as well as the conditions that close it, then gradually shift the balance toward openness. The insight into interdependence also transforms how you work with difficult circumstances and challenging relationships. Instead of seeing problems as solid obstacles that must be overcome through force, you begin to see them as configurations of conditions that can be gradually shifted through skillful engagement. A difficult relationship is not a fixed situation, but a dynamic process involving two or more people, each bringing their own conditioning, each responding to the other's responses, each capable of influencing the overall pattern through their own choices. This perspective opens up creative possibilities that are invisible when you think in terms of independent entities trying to control each other. Understanding interdependence deeply also reveals the arbitrary nature of most boundaries and categories that ordinary consciousness takes to be solid and important. The distinction between self and other, inside and outside, success and failure, good and bad, all prove to be useful conveniences rather than fundamental realities. This does not mean these distinctions become meaningless, but that they are held more lightly and used more skillfully. You can function effectively within conventional categories while maintaining awareness that they are constructions rather than discoveries. Gap. 2S. The Buddha used many metaphors to illustrate the principle of interdependence, each highlighting different aspects of this fundamental insight. Reality is like a vast net of jewels, each jewel reflecting all the others, so that changing any one jewel changes the entire net. Existence is like a tree with roots, trunk, branches and leaves, all depending on each other for the life of the whole. Consciousness is like space, allowing all phenomena to arise within it while being influenced by everything that appears. These metaphors point toward a way of seeing that transcends the usual subject-object dualism of ordinary perception and reveals the seamless wholeness that underlies apparent separation. Part 8. The Inheritance of Action. Every intentional action creates consequences that shape future experience in precise and discoverable ways. This principle, called karma in Sanskrit, represents one of the Buddha's most empirically grounded insights and one of his most practically important teachings for understanding how to live skillfully. But karma, as the Buddha taught it, bears little resemblance to the popular notion of cosmic justice or supernatural reward and punishment systems. It is instead a sophisticated understanding of how consciousness conditions itself through its own choices, creating the very circumstances it will encounter in the future. The word karma literally means action, but the Buddha's analysis focuses specifically on intentional action, choices made with conscious volition rather than purely instinctive or reflexive responses. Every moment of deliberate thought, every word spoken with conscious intent, every behavior chosen from among alternatives creates karmic formations that influence how consciousness will perceive and respond to future situations. These formations operate like seeds planted in the field of consciousness, remaining dormant until the right conditions arise for them to ripen into experience. Understanding this process provides a precise method for taking responsibility for your own spiritual development and psychological well-being. The Buddha identified 3 types of karma based on the medium through which intentional action is expressed. Mental karma includes all conscious thoughts, intentions, and mental attitudes, particularly those that are deliberately cultivated or reinforced through repetition. Verbal karma encompasses not just spoken words, but all forms of communication, including written expression, body language, and even the quality of silence you maintain in different situations. Physical karma involves all bodily actions performed with conscious intent, from obvious behaviors like helping or harming others, to subtle actions like how you hold your posture or the care with which you handle objects. But the Buddha's analysis goes much deeper than simply cataloguing different types of action. He recognized that the karmic power of any action depends not primarily on its external form, but on the mental states that motivate it. The same external behavior can create completely different karmic results depending on whether it arises from greed, hatred, and delusion, or from generosity, loving kindness, and wisdom. Giving money to charity creates positive karma when motivated by genuine compassion, but can create negative karma when motivated by desire for recognition or tax benefits. Speaking truthfully creates beneficial results when intended to help others understand reality clearly, but can create harmful results when used as a weapon to hurt someone with painful facts. This emphasis on motivation reveals that karma is fundamentally about the development of consciousness rather than external reward and punishment. Every intentional action strengthens the mental patterns that created it, making similar intentions more likely to arise in the future. Acts of kindness increase your capacity for kindness. Moments of mindfulness develop the tendency toward mindfulness. Choices made from wisdom reinforce wisdom itself. Conversely, actions motivated by selfishness strengthen selfish tendencies. Choices made from anger increase the likelihood of future anger. Behaviors driven by confusion create more confusion. Gap 1S. Karma is consciousness training itself through its own choices. The Buddha also taught that karmic results can ripen in different time frames depending on various factors, including the intensity of the intention, the nature of the action, and the circumstances under which it was performed. Some karma produces results immediately, within the same lifetime or even the same day. Harsh words spoken in anger often create immediate tension in relationships. Generous actions frequently generate immediate feelings of joy and connection. Dishonest behavior commonly produces immediate anxiety about being discovered. Other karma may not ripen until future lifetimes, remaining dormant in consciousness, like seeds waiting for the right conditions to sprout. The teaching on karma extends beyond individual actions to include the cumulative effect of habitual patterns maintained over time. The Buddha observed that consciousness develops strong tendencies based on which mental states and behaviors are repeatedly reinforced. Someone who habitually responds to challenges with fear develops increasingly fearful patterns of perception and response, while someone who consistently meets difficulties with courage builds confidence and resilience. These psychological tendencies shape not only personal experience, but also the kinds of circumstances and relationships that person will encounter, because like attracts like in the realm of consciousness. This understanding of habitual karma provides a precise method for psychological transformation. Instead of trying to change deeply rooted patterns through willpower alone, You can systematically cultivate their opposites through repeated intentional practice. If you want to develop greater patience, you deliberately practice patience in small situations until it becomes natural in larger ones. If you want to increase compassion, you consciously cultivate compassionate thoughts and actions until compassion becomes your default response to suffering. This approach works with the natural laws of mental development rather than fighting against them. The Buddha's teaching on karma also includes the crucial insight that not all experiences are the result of past karma. He identified several types of suffering that arise from causes other than previous intentional actions: suffering caused by present choices, suffering due to natural physical processes, suffering created by external circumstances beyond personal control, and suffering that results from the basic conditions of embodied existence. This recognition prevents the misuse of karma doctrine to blame people for their circumstances or to justify social inequalities as spiritually appropriate. Karma explains some aspects of experience, but not everything that happens to conscious beings. The relationship between karma and rebirth represents one of the most complex aspects of Buddhist psychology. The Buddha taught that consciousness continues after physical death, carrying with it the karmic formations created through lifetimes of intentional action. These formations influence the conditions of rebirth and the circumstances encountered in future lives. But this teaching must be understood within the context of his analysis of personal identity. What continues is not a solid, unchanging soul, but a stream of conditioned consciousness, shaped by accumulated intentions and habits. Rebirth is more like one candle lighting another than like a person moving from one house to another. Whether or not one accepts the doctrine of literal rebirth, the psychological principles underlying karma remain immediately verifiable through careful observation. Every conscious choice shapes the mind that will make future choices. Every intentional action influences the capacity for future action. Every moment of mental training affects how consciousness will respond to similar situations in the future. These processes operate continuously within each lifetime, regardless of what may or may not happen after death. Understanding them provides practical guidance for spiritual development that does not depend on metaphysical beliefs. The Buddha also taught methods for purifying negative karma and accelerating the development of positive karma. Confession and genuine remorse can help neutralize harmful actions by acknowledging their destructive effects and strengthening the intention to avoid similar choices in the future. Deliberate acts of generosity, kindness, and service can counterbalance selfish tendencies developed through past actions. Meditation and mindfulness practice can interrupt unconscious reactive patterns before they create new negative karma. Most powerfully, developing insight into the nature of reality can transform the entire karmic process by revealing the constructed nature of the self that seems to be accumulating karma. The ultimate goal of understanding karma is not to become skillful at manipulating outcomes, but to develop the wisdom that transcends the entire cycle of action and reaction. When consciousness recognizes its own constructed nature and the interdependent nature of all phenomena, the compulsive drive to create karma naturally diminishes. Actions continue to occur, but they arise from wisdom and compassion, rather than from the desperate attempt to establish and maintain a separate identity. This represents what might be called transcendent karma, action that serves the liberation of all beings without reinforcing the illusion of a separate actor. The teaching on karma concludes with the recognition that every moment offers a fresh opportunity to shape consciousness through conscious choice. Regardless of what patterns have been established in the past, each moment of awareness provides the possibility of choosing responses that support greater freedom, wisdom, and compassion. This makes the present moment the most important time for spiritual development, because it is the only time when karma is actually being created. The past is gone and cannot be changed, the future depends on present choices, but the present moment is alive with the potential for transformation through conscious intention and skillful action. Part 9. The nature of awareness itself. Consciousness is the most intimate aspect of existence, yet it remains the most mysterious. Every experience you have ever had occurred within consciousness. Every thought you have ever thought arose in awareness. Every sensation, emotion, and perception appeared in the space of conscious knowing. Yet, when you try to examine consciousness directly, it seems to slip away like mercury, impossible to grasp or pin down with ordinary conceptual thinking. The Buddha's investigation into the nature of mind represents perhaps his most subtle and profound contribution to human understanding, revealing consciousness to be both the source of all suffering and the key to complete liberation. The Buddha's analysis of consciousness begins with a careful distinction between consciousness itself and its contents. Ordinary awareness is usually so absorbed in what it is conscious of that it never examines the knowing quality itself. You are aware of thoughts, but rarely aware of the awareness in which thoughts arise. You experience emotions, but seldom notice the experiencing itself. You perceive sights and sounds, but hardly ever observe the perceiving that makes perception possible. This constant outward focus creates the illusion that consciousness is produced by its contents, rather than recognizing that contents arise within consciousness. The Buddha identified 6 types of consciousness corresponding to the 6 sense doors: eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness, and mind consciousness. Each type of consciousness arises when its corresponding sense organ encounters an appropriate object in the presence of attention. Eye consciousness occurs when the visual organ meets color and form while attention is present. Ear consciousness arises when the auditory system encounters sound waves while awareness is active, and so forth. Mind consciousness, the 6th type, arises when the mental sense organ encounters thoughts, memories, emotions, and other mental phenomena while attention is directed inward. But this analysis of consciousness goes much deeper than simply cataloguing different types of sensory awareness. The Buddha recognized that consciousness itself has no inherent characteristics apart from the pure capacity to know or be aware. Unlike its contents, which are constantly changing and have specific qualities like color, texture, temperature, or emotional tone, consciousness itself is like clear space that allows all phenomena to appear without being changed by any of them. A mirror can reflect anything, but the reflective capacity itself is not altered by what it reflects. Similarly, consciousness can be aware of any experience, but the aware quality itself remains untouched by the specific content of awareness. This insight into the nature of consciousness reveals why identification with mental and emotional contents creates suffering. When consciousness mistakes itself for its contents, it becomes subject to all the changes, conflicts, and limitations of those contents. Gap 1s. If you identify with your thoughts, you suffer when disturbing thoughts arise because they seem to threaten who you are. If you identify with your emotions, you become trapped in their ups and downs because your sense of well-being depends on having the right emotional states. If you identify with your roles and achievements, you become vulnerable to any threats to those external identities because they seem to endanger your very existence. The Buddha's investigation revealed that this identification process is both unnecessary and based on a fundamental misunderstanding. Consciousness does not need to identify with anything to maintain its essential nature as aware presence. Thoughts can arise and pass away without consciousness being diminished. Emotions can flow through awareness without affecting its basic stability. Sensations can appear and disappear without changing the capacity to experience them. Recognizing this natural freedom of consciousness from its contents is one of the most liberating insights available to human understanding. The practice of investigating consciousness typically begins with learning to observe the contents of awareness without being absorbed by them. This involves developing what might be called metacognition, the ability to be aware of being aware. Instead of just thinking thoughts, you learn to notice that you are thinking. Instead of just experiencing emotions, you develop the capacity to observe emotional processes occurring within awareness. This shift from being lost in experience to observing experience creates tremendous psychological freedom because it reveals that you are not identical with whatever happens to be arising in consciousness. As this capacity for metacognition develops, practitioners often discover what is called witness consciousness, a quality of aware presence that observes all mental activity without being disturbed by any of it. This witness is not another thought or mental state, but rather the inherent capacity of consciousness to know its own contents. From this perspective, even the most intense emotions and the most compelling thoughts are recognized as temporary appearances in the space of awareness rather than as threats to your essential nature. This discovery can provide profound relief from psychological suffering because it reveals a dimension of your being that is naturally peaceful and unassailable. But the Buddha's analysis goes even beyond the recognition of witness consciousness to question whether there is ultimately any experiencer separate from experience itself. When you look very carefully for the one who is aware, what do you actually find? Is there a solid entity that possesses consciousness? Or is there simply consciousness itself appearing to create a sense of someone who is conscious? This investigation often reveals that the apparent experiencer is itself just another experience arising in awareness, no more solid or permanent than any other mental phenomenon. This insight leads to what might be called non-dual awareness, the recognition that consciousness and its contents are not ultimately separate. Awareness and what is aware of are revealed to be two sides of the same process, like the wetness of water or the heat of fire. There is no consciousness apart from what it is conscious of, and no experience apart from the consciousness in which it appears. This non-dual recognition dissolves the subject-object dualism that characterizes ordinary perception and reveals reality to be seamlessly whole, rather than composed of separate entities encountering each other. The Buddha also investigated different states of consciousness that become available through sustained meditative practice. He described a series of increasingly refined states called jhanas, characterized by progressively deeper levels of concentration, tranquility, and mental unification. In these states, ordinary mental activity gradually subsides, revealing subtler dimensions of consciousness that are usually obscured by the constant chatter of thoughts and the turbulence of emotions. These concentrated states provide both temporary refuge from psychological suffering and clear platforms for investigating the nature of awareness itself. The deepest levels of meditative absorption can culminate in what the Buddha called the cessation of perception and feeling, a temporary suspension of all conscious activity. Practitioners who enter this state report that consciousness appears to stop completely, yet somehow awareness continues at a level so subtle it cannot be described in ordinary language. This experience provides direct evidence that consciousness is not produced by mental activity, but is rather the space in which all mental activity appears and disappears. It suggests that awareness itself is more fundamental than any particular state of consciousness. The Buddha's teaching on consciousness also addresses the relationship between individual awareness and universal consciousness. While maintaining that each being has its own stream of consciousness shaped by unique karmic formations, he also suggested that at the deepest level, all consciousness shares the same essential nature. Just as individual waves are expressions of the same ocean, individual minds can be understood as expressions of the same universal capacity for awareness. This understanding provides the foundation for genuine compassion because the suffering of others is recognized as arising within the same field of consciousness that includes your own experience. The practical implications of understanding consciousness in this way are profound and immediate. When you recognize that you are not identical with the contents of your awareness, psychological problems become much more workable because they no longer threaten your essential identity. When you discover the natural peace and stability of consciousness itself, external circumstances lose their power to disturb your fundamental well-being. When you glimpse the non-dual nature of awareness, the artificial separation between self and world begins to dissolve, revealing the intimacy and interconnectedness that were always already present. The Buddha's investigation into consciousness concludes with the recognition that complete liberation involves neither transcending consciousness nor improving it, but simply recognizing its true nature. Consciousness is already free, already peaceful, already whole. What creates the illusion of bondage and suffering is the misidentification of consciousness with its temporary contents rather than recognizing it as the changeless space in which all change appears. Liberation is not a new state to be achieved, but the recognition of what was never actually bound. Part 10. The Laboratory of Inner Experience. Meditation in Buddhism is not relaxation, though it can be deeply peaceful. It is not escapism, though it provides refuge from mental chaos. It is not self-hypnosis or positive thinking, though it can transform your relationship with difficult thoughts and emotions. Buddhist meditation is systematic training in awareness itself, a precise methodology for investigating the nature of consciousness and reality through direct observation rather than philosophical speculation. It represents perhaps the most sophisticated technology for studying the mind that human civilization has ever developed. Every insight the Buddha taught can be verified through sustained meditative investigation, making this not a matter of belief, but of empirical discovery. The foundation of all Buddhist meditation practices rests on developing what is called sati, usually translated as mindfulness, but encompassing a much richer set of mental qualities than the English word suggests. Sati includes clear awareness of present moment experience, accurate recognition of what is actually happening without distortion or elaboration, continuous attention that does not get lost in mental commentary, and wise discernment that can distinguish between helpful and unhelpful mental states. These qualities work together to create a stable platform for investigating reality directly, rather than through the filter of habitual assumptions and reactive patterns. The Buddha identified 4 foundations of mindfulness that provide a complete framework for training attention and developing insight. These four foundations encompass every aspect of human experience, ensuring that no dimension of existence remains unconscious or unexamined. Mindfulness of the body includes awareness of breathing, posture, movement and physical sensations, grounding consciousness in immediate embodied reality, and providing refuge from the endless proliferation of mental activity. This foundation teaches you to inhabit your body fully, rather than living primarily in concepts and abstractions about experience. The practice of mindfulness of breathing deserves special attention because it serves as the cornerstone of most Buddhist meditation systems. The breath provides an ideal object for developing concentration because it is always available, naturally rhythmic, intimately connected to both body and mind, and neutral enough not to trigger strong emotional reactions. But mindfulness of breathing goes far beyond simply counting breaths or using breathing as a relaxation technique. It involves developing such precise awareness of the breathing process that you can observe the subtle qualities of each inhalation and exhalation, the natural pauses between breaths, the way breathing changes in response to mental states, and eventually the arising and passing away of each moment of breath awareness itself. As mindfulness of breathing develops, practitioners typically discover that what seemed like a simple process is actually composed of countless subtle phenomena. Each breath has texture, temperature, rhythm, depth and quality that change from moment to moment in response to both physical and psychological conditions. The space between breaths reveals itself to be alive with awareness rather than empty of experience. The relationship between breathing and thinking becomes apparent as you notice how mental activity affects breath patterns and how conscious breathing influences the quality of thoughts and emotions. This discovery of subtlety and interdependence in something as ordinary as breathing provides direct training in perceiving the profound within the mundane. Mindfulness of feelings, the second foundation, involves developing sensitivity to the immediate feeling tone that accompanies every moment of conscious experience. Before you recognize what you're experiencing and before you develop stories about what it means, there is a split second of pure feeling tone, either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. This feeling tone arises automatically and is not yet problematic, but it immediately triggers habitual patterns of craving and resistance that create psychological suffering. Learning to observe feeling tone directly, before reactive patterns take over, provides the key to interrupting the cycle of craving that the Buddha identified as the root of all suffering. The practice of observing feeling tone requires extraordinary precision and patience because these phenomena are subtle and brief. Pleasant feeling tone might last only a few seconds before being overlaid with grasping and the fear of losing the pleasant experience. Unpleasant feeling tone quickly becomes obscured by resistance and stories about why this experience should not be happening. Neutral feeling tone is often missed entirely because the mind immediately goes looking for something more interesting or stimulating. Developing the ability to catch these feeling tones before they trigger reactive patterns is like learning to observe the spark before it ignites the fire. Mindfulness of mind, the third foundation, involves stepping back from the contents of consciousness to observe the processes of consciousness itself. Instead of being lost in particular thoughts or emotions, you develop the capacity to recognize different mental states as they arise and pass away. You learn to observe anger without becoming angry, to notice fear without being afraid, to watch desire without being driven by it. This creates what psychologists now call cognitive diffusion, the ability to observe mental phenomena without being automatically controlled by them. This aspect of mindfulness practice reveals that most psychological suffering comes not from having difficult thoughts and emotions, but from believing that you are identical with whatever happens to be arising in consciousness. When you can observe anxiety as a temporary visitor in awareness rather than something that defines who you are, the anxiety may still be uncomfortable, but it no longer threatens your fundamental sense of identity and well-being. When you can watch angry thoughts arise and dissolve like clouds in the sky of awareness, the anger loses much of its compulsive power because you are no longer identified with it. This shift from being your thoughts and emotions to observing your thoughts and emotions represents one of the most transformative insights available through meditation practice. Mindfulness of phenomena, the fourth foundation, involves observing how all experiences arise and dissolve according to natural laws rather than personal preference. This includes investigating the three characteristics that the Buddha identified as universal features of conditioned existence: impermanence, suffering, and the absence of a fixed self. Through sustained observation, you begin to see these characteristics operating in real time, rather than just understanding them intellectually. You witness thoughts arising from nowhere and dissolving back into nowhere, emotions appearing and disappearing without anyone making them come or go, sensations constantly changing without any central controller orchestrating the changes. This direct observation of how phenomena actually behave, independent of your wishes and preferences, gradually undermines the illusion that you are in control of experience or that experience should conform to your desires. This is not a depressing recognition, but a profoundly liberating one, because it reveals that the burden of trying to control uncontrollable processes has been unnecessary all along. You can relax into the natural flow of experience rather than exhausting yourself trying to make it conform to your preferences. This relaxation is not passive resignation, but intelligent alignment with the way reality actually functions. The Buddha also taught specific meditation practices for developing concentration, the ability to sustain attention on a single object for extended periods without distraction or dullness. While mindfulness involves open awareness of whatever is arising, concentration involves focused attention that gradually unifies the mind and reveals increasingly subtle dimensions of consciousness. The Buddha described 8 levels of concentrative absorption called jhanas, each characterized by specific qualities of joy, peace, and mental unification. These states provide both temporary relief from psychological suffering and stable platforms for developing profound insights into the nature of reality. The first jhana arises when the mind becomes absorbed in its meditation object, to the point where ordinary mental chatter subsides and is replaced by sustained attention accompanied by feelings of joy and physical pleasure. This state can be remarkably blissful, providing direct evidence that happiness does not require external stimulation, but can be cultivated through training the mind itself. The second jhana occurs when even the effort required to maintain concentration dissolves, leaving only pure joy and tranquility. The third and fourth jhanas involve progressively subtler states of peace and equanimity, as even joy is recognized as a form of mental activity that eventually becomes unnecessary. Beyond the 4 jhanas, the Buddha described 4 additional states called the formless absorptions, where attention moves beyond physical sensations entirely and rests in increasingly refined dimensions of consciousness. The absorption in infinite space involves the recognition that awareness itself is boundless and without edges. The absorption in infinite consciousness involves recognizing that this boundless awareness is also alive and knowing. The absorption in nothingness involves the discovery that even consciousness, as usually understood, is not the deepest level of awareness. The absorption in neither perception nor non-perception points toward dimensions of awareness so subtle they cannot be described in ordinary language. While these concentrated states can be profoundly peaceful and insightful, the Buddha emphasized that they are not ends in themselves, but tools for developing the wisdom that leads to complete liberation. Some practitioners become so attracted to these blissful states that they mistake them for enlightenment itself. But the Buddha pointed out that they are still conditioned experiences that arise and pass away. True liberation involves understanding the nature of all conditioned states, including the most refined meditative absorptions, rather than becoming attached to any particular level of consciousness. The jhanas provide powerful support for insight practice, but insight itself must be cultivated through careful investigation of how all phenomena arise and dissolve according to natural laws. The Buddha also taught walking meditation as a complement to sitting practice, recognizing that consciousness needs to be trained in both stillness and movement. Walking meditation involves bringing the same quality of mindful attention to the simple act of walking that is brought to breathing in sitting practice. You observe the lifting, moving and placing of each foot, the shifting of weight from one leg to another, the movement of muscles and joints, the coordination required to maintain balance while moving forward. This practice helps integrate meditative awareness into daily activity and prevents the common mistake of thinking that mindfulness is only possible in formal meditation sessions. The integration of meditation practice with daily life represents one of the most important aspects of Buddhist training. The insights and skills developed during formal meditation sessions must be gradually extended to include all activities if they are to transform consciousness permanently, rather than providing only temporary relief from ordinary mental patterns. This integration happens through bringing meditative awareness to routine activities like eating, cleaning, walking, and even speaking and listening in conversations. Eventually, the distinction between meditation and daily life dissolves as awareness becomes continuous rather than something that is turned on and off at scheduled times. The Buddha concluded his teaching on meditation with the recognition that ultimately there is no meditator, no meditation technique, and no goal to be achieved through meditation. These are all conventional designations that are useful for getting started, but must eventually be transcended as practice matures. What remains is simply awareness being aware of itself, consciousness knowing its own nature directly without the mediation of concepts or techniques. This represents the fruition of meditation practice, not the achievement of some special state, but the recognition of what was always already present, beneath the layer of mental construction and seeking. Part 11. The Ethics of Awakening. Buddhist ethics emerge not from divine commandments or social conventions, but from clear seeing into the nature of reality and the consequences of different types of action. When you understand how deeply interconnected all existence is, harming others becomes as self-defeating as harming yourself. When you recognize the constructed nature of the ego that seems to benefit from selfish behavior, the motivation for such behavior naturally diminishes. When you see directly how much suffering comes from acting out of greed, hatred, and delusion, the cultivation of generosity, love, and wisdom becomes not a moral obligation, but an expression of sanity. The foundation of Buddhist ethics rests on what the Buddha called the three roots of wholesome action: non-greed, non-hatred, and non-delusion. These are not merely the absence of negative qualities, but positive mental states with their own characteristics and benefits. Non-greed manifests as generosity, contentment, and the ability to appreciate what is present rather than constantly seeking more. Non-hatred appears as loving kindness, patience, and the capacity to respond to difficulty with wisdom rather than reactivity. Non-delusion expresses itself as clarity, understanding, and the ability to see situations as they actually are, rather than through the distortions of wishful thinking or fear. The practice of generosity, called dana in Sanskrit, holds a special place in Buddhist training because it directly counters the grasping mentality that creates so much psychological suffering. Generosity involves not just giving material things to others, but cultivating a fundamental shift from a scarcity mentality to an abundance mentality. This shift recognizes that holding on tightly to possessions, experiences, and even ideas creates tension and anxiety, while letting go creates space for greater happiness and freedom. True generosity gives without expecting anything in return, without keeping score, and without using giving as a strategy to gain approval or control others. The Buddha identified different levels of generosity that correspond to different degrees of spiritual development. Beginner's generosity involves giving material things while still feeling some attachment to what is given, perhaps hoping for recognition or feeling proud of one's charitable activities. Intermediate generosity gives more freely, but still maintains some sense of a generous person doing good deeds for deserving recipients. Advanced generosity transcends the dualistic framework of giver, gift and recipient entirely, recognizing that the apparent boundaries between self and other are constructions that limit the natural flow of caring and support. The cultivation of loving kindness, called metta, represents another cornerstone of Buddhist ethical practice. But loving kindness, as taught by the Buddha, is not sentimental emotion or forced friendliness, but a specific mental training that systematically removes the barriers that separate you from other beings. The practice typically begins with cultivating genuine goodwill toward yourself, recognizing that you cannot truly care for others if you are constantly at war with your own mind and emotions. This self-directed kindness is not self-indulgence, but intelligent self-care that creates the inner stability necessary for caring effectively for others. Once loving kindness toward yourself has been established, the practice extends to include loved ones, then neutral people, then difficult people, and eventually all living beings throughout the universe. This systematic expansion challenges the mind's habitual tendency to divide the world into categories of us and them, friend and enemy, deserving and undeserving. The practice reveals that these divisions are arbitrary constructions that limit your capacity for connection and happiness while increasing stress and conflict. As the heart opens to include more and more beings, the artificial boundaries that create loneliness and alienation naturally dissolve. The Buddha also taught specific practices for working with anger and resentment, recognizing that these emotions pose particular challenges for developing loving kindness. The traditional approach involves neither suppressing angry feelings nor indulging them, but understanding them clearly enough to transform their underlying energy. Anger often arises from caring about something important that seems threatened or violated, which means it contains valuable information about your values and concerns. The skillful response involves extracting this information while letting go of the destructive emotional charge that makes anger harmful to both yourself and others. One powerful method for working with anger involves investigating the stories that fuel it. Anger rarely arises from situations themselves, but from interpretations of situations, particularly interpretations that involve someone deliberately trying to harm you or acting in ways that violate your sense of how things should be. When you examine these stories carefully, you often discover that they are based on assumptions about other people's motivations that may not be accurate. Most people are doing the best they can, given their current understanding and circumstances, even when their actions create problems for you. This recognition does not excuse harmful behavior, but it removes the extra layer of suffering that comes from taking other people's actions personally. Compassion, called karuna, builds on loving kindness by adding the element of skillful response to suffering wherever it is encountered. While loving kindness wishes for beings to be happy, compassion specifically wishes for beings to be free from suffering and takes action to help make that freedom possible. True compassion requires considerable strength and wisdom because it means being willing to face suffering directly without being overwhelmed by it and responding from clarity rather than emotional reactivity. Compassion can sometimes look harsh from the outside, as when it involves saying no to requests that would enable harmful patterns or refusing to participate in collective delusions that make people feel better temporarily but cause greater harm in the long run. The Buddha distinguished between what might be called emotional compassion and wisdom compassion. Emotional compassion feels the pain of others and wants to relieve it immediately, which can lead to burnout, enabling behavior and responses that actually increase suffering in the long term. Wisdom. Compassion understands the causes of suffering and responds in ways that address those causes rather than just treating symptoms. This might involve allowing people to experience the natural consequences of their actions rather than rescuing them, or providing guidance and support for developing skills rather than just offering comfort. Wisdom compassion is sustainable because it does not depend on fixing everyone else's problems, but focuses on providing the conditions that allow people to develop their own wisdom and strength. The practice of mudita, usually translated as sympathetic joy, represents one of the most challenging aspects of Buddhist ethical training for most people. Mudita involves genuinely celebrating the happiness and success of others, even when their good fortune might seem to diminish your own opportunities or highlight your own limitations. This practice directly confronts the comparative mind that constantly evaluates your position relative to others and creates suffering through envy, jealousy and competition. Developing the capacity to be genuinely happy for others' good fortune, regardless of your own circumstances, represents a profound shift from scarcity consciousness to abundance consciousness. The cultivation of mudita reveals how much psychological energy is typically wasted on comparing yourself to others and feeling either superior or inferior based on those comparisons. When you can celebrate others' achievements without feeling diminished and appreciate others' good qualities without feeling inadequate, tremendous mental space opens up for focusing on your own development and contribution. This is not about becoming indifferent to your own needs and goals, but about pursuing them from a place of inner abundance rather than desperate competition. Mudita transforms relationships from zero-sum games where one person's gain requires another's loss into collaborative celebrations of the potential for happiness and fulfillment that exists within all conscious beings. Equanimity, called upekkha, represents the culmination of ethical development and provides the foundation for all other positive qualities. Equanimity is not indifference or detachment, but a quality of balanced awareness that can remain clear and responsive regardless of circumstances. It includes the wisdom to distinguish between what can be skillfully influenced and what must be accepted as it is, the strength to remain calm in the midst of chaos, and the flexibility to respond appropriately to constantly changing conditions. Equanimity allows you to care deeply about the welfare of all beings while maintaining perspective about the long-term nature of the development process and your own limited role in that process. The Buddha also taught specific guidelines for ethical conduct that support the development of these heart qualities. The 5 precepts provide a basic framework for avoiding actions that create suffering for yourself and others. Refraining from killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, lying, and consuming intoxicants that cloud judgment. But these precepts are not arbitrary rules imposed from outside, but practical guidelines based on understanding how different types of action affect consciousness and relationships. Each precept, when followed with wisdom rather than rigid adherence, creates conditions that support greater peace, trust, and clarity in both personal experience and social interaction. The precept against killing extends beyond obvious violence to include all forms of causing unnecessary harm to living beings. This includes being mindful of how your lifestyle choices affect other creatures, how your words might wound others psychologically, and how your mental attitudes might contribute to a culture of aggression and insensitivity. The positive aspect of this precept involves actively cultivating respect for life in all its forms and looking for ways to contribute to the flourishing of other beings rather than just avoiding harm. This might manifest as choosing foods and products that minimize environmental damage, speaking in ways that uplift rather than diminish others, and maintaining mental attitudes that support life rather than destruction. Buddhist ethics conclude with the recognition that genuine morality cannot be separated from wisdom and mental training. Ethical behavior that is maintained through willpower alone tends to be rigid, judgmental, and ultimately unsustainable when conditions become challenging. Ethics that arise from understanding the interconnected nature of existence and the consequences of different types of action become natural expressions of wisdom rather than imposed constraints on natural impulses. This transformation of motivation makes ethical living not a burden to be carried, but a source of joy and fulfillment that enhances rather than restricts authentic self-expression. Part 12. The Flowering of Understanding. The Buddha recognized that different people require different approaches to awakening based on their temperaments, life circumstances, and psychological development. This recognition led to the emergence of various schools and traditions within Buddhism, each emphasizing particular aspects of the complete teaching while maintaining the core insights into suffering, its causes, and the path to liberation. Rather than representing contradictions or corruptions of the original message, these different approaches reflect the richness and adaptability of the Buddha's essential discoveries about human consciousness and the nature of reality. Understanding these various streams of practice can help you identify the methods most suited to your own development while appreciating the wisdom embedded in approaches that might seem foreign to your temperament. The Theravada tradition, meaning the teaching of the elders, emphasizes individual liberation through systematic training in ethics, concentration, and wisdom. This approach focuses primarily on the historical Buddha's original teachings as preserved in the Pali Canon, maintaining that enlightenment must be achieved through personal effort and cannot be granted by external forces. Theravada meditation practices tend to emphasize careful observation of the arising and passing of phenomena, developing insight into the 3 characteristics of impermanence, suffering, and not-self through direct experience rather than through conceptual analysis. This tradition is particularly suited to people who prefer clear, practical instructions and who are motivated by the goal of personal liberation from suffering. The Theravada path typically progresses through clearly defined stages of awakening, each representing a deeper level of understanding and freedom from the mental patterns that create suffering. The first stage, called stream entry, occurs when practitioners gain direct insight into the constructed nature of personal identity and the futility of seeking lasting satisfaction through external experiences. Stream enterers have not eliminated all suffering from their experience, but they have seen through the fundamental delusions that perpetuate suffering, making further progress inevitable even if it takes many lifetimes to complete. The second and third stages involve progressively weakening the emotional patterns of craving and aversion, while the fourth stage represents complete liberation from all forms of psychological suffering. The Mahayana tradition, meaning the Great Vehicle, emphasizes the liberation of all beings rather than just personal awakening, based on the recognition that individual freedom and universal freedom are ultimately inseparable. This approach introduces the ideal of the bodhisattva, someone who vows to work for the enlightenment of all conscious beings and who may even postpone their own final liberation in order to continue helping others. Mahayana philosophy developed sophisticated analyses of emptiness, the recognition that all phenomena lack inherent existence and arise only in dependence upon causes, conditions, and conceptual designation. This tradition is particularly appealing to people who are naturally inclined toward service and who understand their own development as inseparable from the welfare of others. The Mahayana understanding of emptiness goes beyond the Theravada analysis of not-self to include all phenomena, not just personal identity. Nothing exists independently or inherently, but everything arises through the complex web of interdependent relationships that connect all aspects of reality. This insight, when deeply realized, dissolves the artificial boundaries between self and world, sacred and mundane, samsara and nirvana, revealing reality to be seamlessly whole rather than composed of separate entities. The recognition of universal emptiness becomes the foundation for unlimited compassion, because the barriers that seem to separate your welfare from the welfare of others are revealed to be conceptual constructions rather than ultimate realities. Within the Mahayana tradition, Pure Land Buddhism offers a path particularly suited to people who feel overwhelmed by the apparent difficulty of achieving enlightenment through personal effort alone. This approach emphasizes devotion to Amitabha Buddha, a fully awakened being who has created a pure realm where conditions are perfectly conducive to spiritual development. Through sincere faith and the practice of calling upon Amitabha's name, practitioners can be reborn in this pure land, where enlightenment becomes much more attainable than in our current world of distractions and obstacles. This path transforms the spiritual journey from a solitary struggle to a collaborative relationship with enlightened wisdom that is always available to provide support and guidance. Zen Buddhism, which developed from the meeting of Indian Mahayana philosophy with Chinese Taoist sensibilities, emphasizes direct pointing to the mind's essential nature without dependence on words, concepts, or gradual cultivation. Zen practice often involves intensive meditation retreats, the study of paradoxical teaching stories called koans, and dialogue with qualified teachers who can recognize and confirm authentic insight. This tradition attracts people who prefer immediate, experiential approaches to understanding and who are willing to engage in intensive practice without requiring detailed explanations of how the methods work. Zen's emphasis on ordinary mind being the path appeals to those who suspect that enlightenment is not an exotic achievement, but a recognition of what has always been present. The use of koans in Zen training deserves special attention because it represents a unique method for transcending conceptual thinking and accessing direct insight. Koans are not riddles to be solved intellectually, but spiritual exercises designed to exhaust the mind's habitual ways of processing information and create openings for non-conceptual understanding. Classic koans, like "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" or "What was your original face before your parents were born?" cannot be answered through logical analysis, but require a shift to a completely different mode of knowing. Working with koans trains practitioners to recognize the limitations of conceptual thinking while developing confidence in the mind's capacity for direct, intuitive understanding. Tibetan Buddhism preserved and developed the most comprehensive collection of Buddhist teachings and practices, integrating elements from all previous traditions while adding sophisticated psychological methods derived from Indian tantric traditions. This approach recognizes that different people are at different stages of development and therefore require different methods, leading to a graduated path system that offers appropriate practices for beginners, intermediate students, and advanced practitioners. Tibetan Buddhism is particularly known for its detailed analysis of mental states and emotions, its systematic approach to developing compassion and wisdom, and its use of visualization practices that work directly with the mind's capacity to create and transform reality through imagination. The Tibetan approach to developing compassion involves specific practices designed to systematically remove the barriers that limit natural caring and empathy. The practice of exchanging self and other, called Tonglen, involves deliberately taking on the suffering of others while sending out relief and happiness, directly countering the ego's natural tendency to avoid pain and seek pleasure for itself. This practice might seem masochistic or psychologically harmful, but when done correctly it reveals that much of what we call suffering is actually resistance to natural human emotions like sadness, fear, and disappointment. By learning to breathe with difficult feelings rather than fighting against them, practitioners develop the capacity to be present with suffering without being overwhelmed by it. The tantric elements within Tibetan Buddhism offer advanced practices for students who have developed sufficient stability and ethical foundation to work safely with powerful psychological energies. These methods recognize that the same mental energies that create suffering, when unconsciously expressed, can become vehicles for rapid spiritual development when consciously directed. Tantric practice involves sophisticated visualization techniques, mantra recitation, and ritual activities that engage the whole person, body, speech, and mind in the process of transformation. This approach is particularly suitable for people who learn better through engagement and activity rather than through stillness and observation alone. Modern Western adaptations of Buddhist practice have focused primarily on meditation techniques and psychological insights, while generally de-emphasizing elements like rebirth, devotional practices, and elaborate philosophical systems. This adaptation has made Buddhist methods accessible to people who might not be attracted to traditional Asian religious forms while preserving the essential practices that directly address psychological suffering. Mindfulness-based stress reduction, acceptance and commitment therapy, and other therapeutic approaches demonstrate that Buddhist insights can be effectively separated from their original cultural contexts without losing their transformative power. This development suggests that the Buddha's discoveries about consciousness and suffering represent universal principles rather than culturally specific beliefs. The diversity of Buddhist traditions demonstrates that there is no single correct way to apply the Buddha's teachings, but rather many skillful approaches that can be adapted to different personalities, cultures, and historical circumstances. What remains consistent across all authentic Buddhist schools is the recognition that suffering arises from misunderstanding the nature of reality, and that this misunderstanding can be corrected through systematic training in awareness, ethics, and wisdom. The particular methods used to develop this understanding may vary dramatically, but the underlying insights into impermanence, interdependence, and the constructed nature of personal identity remain constant. This flexibility ensures that Buddhist wisdom can continue to evolve and adapt to new circumstances while maintaining its essential effectiveness for alleviating human suffering. Part 13. The Stages of Liberation. Awakening is not a single dramatic event, but a gradual process of seeing through the illusions that create suffering, with clearly identifiable milestones that mark increasing degrees of freedom and understanding. The Buddha mapped this developmental process with extraordinary precision, identifying specific insights that characterize different levels of realization and describing the psychological changes that occur as consciousness recognizes its own true nature. Understanding these stages provides both encouragement for practitioners and realistic expectations about the path, preventing both discouragement when progress seems slow and premature, claims of attainment when insights are still partial. Most importantly, these stages reveal that liberation is not about achieving some exotic state, but about progressively letting go of the mental constructions that obscure the natural peace and freedom that were always already present. The first significant milestone on the path to liberation is called stream entry, the moment when consciousness gains direct, unshakable insight into several fundamental truths about existence. Stream enterers have not eliminated all suffering from their experience, but they have seen through the basic delusions that perpetuate suffering, making further progress inevitable even if it requires additional lifetimes to complete. This stage is characterized by three specific realizations that permanently alter how consciousness relates to experience. Direct understanding of the impermanent nature of all conditioned phenomena. Visceral recognition that seeking lasting satisfaction through external experiences is futile and clear. Seeing into the constructed nature of personal identity. The stream enterer's insight into impermanence goes beyond intellectual acknowledgement to become a felt sense that everything experienced through the six senses is constantly arising and dissolving with extraordinary rapidity. This recognition destroys what Buddhism calls the illusion of permanence, the unconscious assumption that things exist as solid, stable entities rather than as dynamic processes. Once this illusion is shattered through direct observation, consciousness can no longer cling to experiences in the same desperate way because it becomes obvious that there is nothing solid to grasp. This does not eliminate preferences or the natural human tendency to enjoy pleasant experiences, but it removes the frantic quality that comes from trying to make temporary experiences permanent. The recognition of the futility of seeking lasting satisfaction through conditioned experiences represents perhaps the most practically important insight of stream entry. Stream enterers have directly seen that every experience, no matter how pleasant or meaningful, contains within it the seeds of its own dissatisfaction because no experience can provide the unconditional fulfillment that consciousness is unconsciously seeking. This recognition does not lead to nihilism or withdrawal from life, but to a fundamental shift in motivation from seeking happiness through accumulating experiences to discovering the happiness that is independent of particular conditions. This shift removes the underlying anxiety that drives much compulsive behavior while opening space for more authentic engagement with whatever circumstances arise. The stream enterer's understanding of the constructed nature of personal identity permanently dissolves what Buddhism calls personality view, the belief in a solid, continuous self that exists independently of changing conditions. This does not mean that stream enterers lose all sense of personal identity or become unable to function in social situations that require conventional self-reference. Rather, they recognize that personal identity is a useful convention rather than an ultimate reality, like lines of longitude and latitude that help with navigation but do not actually exist as physical features of the earth. This recognition removes the desperate edge from self-concern because there is less of a sense that a solid entity needs defending or improving. Stream enterers also develop unshakable confidence in what are called the three jewels: the Buddha as the one who discovered and taught the path to liberation, the Dharma as the truth about reality and the methods for realizing that truth, and the Sangha as the community of practitioners who support each other in this investigation. This confidence is not blind faith, but empirical trust based on direct verification that the path actually works as described. Stream enterers have tasted liberation directly, and know beyond doubt that complete freedom from suffering is possible because they have experienced it partially themselves. This confidence provides unshakable motivation for continued practice, even when progress seems slow or obstacles seem insurmountable. The behavioral changes that accompany stream entry include the natural inability to commit actions that would cause serious harm to oneself or others. This is not morality imposed from outside, but ethical behavior that arises spontaneously from understanding how interconnected everything is. Stream enterers cannot engage in deliberate killing, stealing, or other behaviors that create significant suffering because they viscerally understand that harming others ultimately harms the entire web of existence of which they are a part. They also naturally avoid extreme asceticism or indulgence, having directly seen that neither suppressing natural human needs nor compulsively satisfying every desire leads to genuine freedom. The second stage of awakening, called once returning, involves significant weakening of the emotional patterns that create interpersonal conflict and internal turbulence. Once returners have not eliminated greed, hatred and delusion entirely, but these mental states have been greatly reduced in frequency and intensity through continued practice and deepening insight. They experience anger, desire and confusion less often than before, and when these states do arise, they are less compelling and dissolve more quickly without creating the cascading psychological reactions that characterize ordinary emotional patterns. This stage is called once returning because practitioners at this level are said to require at most one more human birth to complete the journey to full liberation. The third stage, called non-returning, represents the complete elimination of all forms of craving and aversion that bind consciousness to the realm of sensual desire. Non-returners have transcended the psychological patterns that create attachment to pleasant experiences and resistance to unpleasant ones, achieving a profound equanimity that remains stable regardless of external circumstances. They no longer experience the restless seeking that characterizes ordinary consciousness because they have discovered a fulfillment that does not depend on particular conditions being present or absent. Non-returners are said to be incapable of being reborn in human form because the desires and fears that create human existence have been permanently resolved. The fourth and final stage, called arahantship or liberation, represents the complete elimination of all forms of psychological suffering through perfect understanding of reality's true nature. Arahants have extinguished the fires of greed, hatred and delusion so completely that they can never arise again under any circumstances. This is not a state of emotional numbness, but of perfect responsiveness, where actions arise spontaneously from wisdom and compassion without being filtered through the distortions of self-concern. Arahants have fulfilled the Buddha's promise that suffering can end completely, demonstrating through their own realization that human consciousness has unlimited potential for freedom and peace. The psychological characteristics of full liberation include several qualities that distinguish arahants from practitioners at earlier stages of development. They experience what is called the unshakable deliverance of mind, a peace so profound that it cannot be disturbed by any external circumstances or internal mental states. They possess perfect confidence in their own understanding, not from arrogance, but from having investigated reality so thoroughly that all doubts about the nature of existence have been permanently resolved. They demonstrate spontaneous ethical behavior that never requires conscious deliberation because all motivations arise from wisdom rather than from conflicting desires and fears. Arahants also develop what are called the divine abodes, unlimited loving-kindness, compassion, empathetic joy and equanimity that extend to all beings without exception or condition. These are not emotions in the ordinary sense, but stable qualities of consciousness that arise naturally when the barriers created by self-concern have been completely dissolved. The love of an arahant does not depend on others being lovable. Their compassion is not diminished by others' resistance to help. Their joy in others' happiness is not tainted by comparison or envy, and their equanimity is not shaken by praise or blame, success or failure, pleasure or pain. This represents the full flowering of human emotional potential when freed from the distortions of unconscious reactivity. The Buddha also described various psychic powers that can develop alongside deep meditative realization, including the ability to read others' minds, recall past lifetimes, and perceive the karmic patterns that shape different beings' experiences. However, he consistently emphasized that these powers are byproducts of spiritual development rather than goals to be pursued, and that becoming attached to them can actually impede progress toward liberation. The essential achievement is not the development of extraordinary abilities, but the ordinary miracle of consciousness, freed from the compulsive patterns that create suffering. A fully liberated being might possess remarkable powers, or might appear completely ordinary, but in either case they will demonstrate the unmistakable qualities of perfect peace, wisdom, and compassion. Modern practitioners sometimes question whether these traditional stages of awakening are still relevant in contemporary contexts, or whether they represent cultural artifacts from a different time and place. Contemporary teachers and researchers have generally confirmed that these developmental patterns continue to occur in modern practitioners, though they may manifest differently depending on cultural background and life circumstances. The essential insights described in each stage appear to be universal features of consciousness development rather than beliefs specific to ancient Indian society. Understanding these stages can provide valuable guidance for contemporary practice while remaining open to the possibility that awakening in the modern world might include dimensions that were not emphasized in traditional descriptions. Part 14. Beyond the fear of ending, death represents the ultimate test of spiritual understanding. the final frontier where all philosophical concepts must yield to direct confrontation with the most fundamental uncertainty of existence. The Buddha's approach to death and what may or may not follow reveals both his practical psychology and his profound insights into the nature of consciousness itself. Rather than offering comforting beliefs or frightening warnings about afterlife destinations, he provided precise analysis of how the fear of death creates suffering and practical methods for developing equanimity in the face of life's most inevitable transition. His teachings on death illuminate not just the end of life, but the entire process of living with awareness of mortality. The Buddha's investigation into death began with the recognition that much psychological suffering comes not from death itself, but from the fear of death that colours every moment of ordinary existence. This fear operates on multiple levels, from obvious anxiety about physical pain and the unknown, to subtle background terror about the cessation of personal identity that drives compulsive attempts to create lasting meaning and permanent security. The fear of death shows up disguised as the fear of failure, the fear of insignificance, the fear of being forgotten, the fear of not having enough time to accomplish everything important. It motivates desperate clinging to youth, frantic accumulation of achievements and possessions, and the exhausting attempt to control circumstances that are ultimately beyond human influence. The Buddha taught that confronting the reality of death directly, rather than avoiding or denying it, actually reduces suffering and increases appreciation for life. This confrontation does not involve morbid preoccupation with dying, but honest acknowledgement that death is natural, universal, and impossible to predict or control. Meditation on death traditionally includes reflecting on the certainty that you will die, the uncertainty of when death will occur, the fact that nothing can help you at the moment of death except your own spiritual development, and the recognition that the time available for meaningful development is constantly decreasing. These contemplations are not meant to create depression, but to generate spiritual urgency and appreciation for the precious opportunity that conscious existence represents. The practice of observing the death process directly, through witnessing the dying of others, or through meditation on the dissolution of the body's systems, reveals death to be a natural process rather than a catastrophic failure. Traditional Buddhist texts describe the stages through which consciousness withdraws from the body during death, beginning with the failure of the grosser physical functions and proceeding through increasingly subtle levels of mental activity until only the most fundamental awareness remains. These descriptions serve not just as maps for understanding death, but as guides for meditation practices that can familiarize consciousness with these subtle levels while still alive. This preparation can make the dying process less frightening and more conducive to maintaining awareness and peace during the transition. The Buddha's teaching on what happens after death reflects his characteristic precision and refusal to speculate beyond what can be known through direct investigation. He taught that consciousness continues after physical death, carrying with it the karmic formations created through lifetimes of intentional action, but that this continuation does not involve the survival of a permanent soul or unchanging personal identity. Death is more like one moment of consciousness giving rise to the next moment of consciousness than like a person moving from one location to another. What continues is not you as you understand yourself now, but the stream of conditioned consciousness that currently manifests as your sense of personal identity. The process of rebirth, according to Buddhist psychology, involves consciousness taking form in circumstances that correspond to the karmic patterns established through previous choices and mental habits. This is not cosmic justice dispensed by an external judge. but natural consequence following from the psychological tendencies developed through countless moments of intention and action. Beings who have cultivated generosity, wisdom and compassion tend to be reborn in circumstances that support further development of these qualities, while beings dominated by greed, hatred and delusion gravitate towards situations that reflect and perpetuate these mental patterns. The realm of rebirth can include not just different human circumstances, but entirely different types of conscious existence, from states of great suffering to states of extraordinary bliss and everything in between. However, the Buddha consistently emphasized that speculation about the details of rebirth is less important than understanding how to live skillfully in the present moment. Whether consciousness continues after death for many lifetimes or ends permanently with the dissolution of the brain, the practical implications of Buddhist psychology remain the same. Suffering arises from unconscious mental patterns that can be transformed through awareness, ethics, and wisdom. The methods for reducing suffering and increasing genuine happiness work regardless of your beliefs about what may happen after death. This practical focus prevents Buddhist practice from becoming escapist fantasy about future lives, while maintaining openness to dimensions of existence that may extend beyond current scientific understanding. For practitioners who do accept the possibility of rebirth, the Buddha taught specific methods for preparing consciousness to navigate the death and rebirth process with greater awareness and choice. These preparations include developing familiarity with subtle states of consciousness through meditative absorption, cultivating positive mental habits that will influence the direction of rebirth, and establishing such clear understanding of reality's true nature that consciousness maintains clarity even during the disorienting transitions that accompany death. Advanced practitioners may develop the ability to choose their circumstances of rebirth consciously, returning to forms of existence where they can continue serving the liberation of all beings most effectively. This represents the fulfillment of the bodhisattva ideal, where personal liberation becomes the foundation for unlimited compassion rather than an escape from the sufferings of existence. The Buddha also taught that the fear of death diminishes naturally as understanding deepens, not through believing comforting stories about afterlife destinations, but through recognizing what death can and cannot actually threaten. Death can end the current configuration of body and personality, but it cannot touch the essential nature of awareness itself, which never comes or goes, but simply allows all changing experiences to appear and disappear within it. Death cannot destroy the positive karma created through beneficial actions, which will continue to influence future experiences regardless of the form those experiences may take. Most importantly, death cannot undo the liberation achieved through seeing reality clearly, because this freedom never depended on maintaining particular physical or mental conditions in the first place. The process of aging provides continuous opportunities to practice working skillfully with impermanence and letting go, serving as a gradual preparation for the final letting go that death represents. Each stage of life involves releasing previous identities, capabilities, and relationships that can no longer be maintained, offering direct training in the art of graceful surrender to natural change. Those who learn to age with wisdom discover that letting go can be liberating rather than tragic, creating space for new forms of appreciation and engagement that were not possible while clinging to earlier phases of life. This same wisdom makes dying easier because death becomes not a loss of everything meaningful, but the final release in a lifelong series of beneficial surrenders to the natural flow of change. Buddhist funeral and mourning practices reflect this understanding by emphasizing celebration of the deceased person's positive actions and continued influence rather than focusing exclusively on grief and loss. While grief is acknowledged as a natural response to separation from loved ones, Buddhist psychology recognizes that excessive mourning can actually interfere with the deceased person's peaceful transition by creating emotional disturbances that bind consciousness to past relationships. The most helpful response to someone's death involves wishing them well in whatever form their consciousness may take next, while using the reminder of mortality to deepen appreciation for the time remaining with others who are still alive. This approach transforms encounters with death from sources of despair into opportunities for renewed commitment to spiritual development and compassionate service. The Buddha's final teaching, delivered as he was dying, exemplifies his approach to death as a natural transition rather than a cosmic tragedy. His last words were reportedly, "All conditioned things are impermanent. Work out your salvation with diligence." This instruction contains both acceptance of the natural process of dissolution that affects all temporary phenomena and encouragement to use the time available for conscious existence as skillfully as possible. It suggests that death is not a problem to be solved, or an enemy to be defeated, but a natural conclusion to be met with the same awareness and equanimity that characterizes wise living at any stage of existence. Part 15. Living the Teaching. The ultimate test of Buddhist understanding is not the depth of your meditative states or the sophistication of your philosophical knowledge, but how effectively you can apply these insights to reduce suffering and increase genuine happiness in the midst of ordinary circumstances. Integration represents the most challenging and most important aspect of spiritual development, requiring you to discover how ancient wisdom can address contemporary problems without losing its essential transformative power. This final stage of practice involves neither rejecting the world nor transcending it, but learning to engage fully with whatever conditions arise while maintaining the inner freedom that comes from understanding reality's true nature. Successful integration makes every moment of daily life a continuation of spiritual practice rather than a distraction from it. The foundation of integration rests on recognizing that no aspect of human experience lies outside the scope of Buddhist psychology. Work and family responsibilities, financial concerns and health challenges, social relationships and creative projects all provide opportunities to apply the insights of impermanence, interdependence, and not self in practical ways. The goal is not to become a perfect Buddhist, but to become a more conscious, compassionate and wise human being who uses whatever circumstances arise as raw material for continued development, rather than obstacles to spiritual progress. This shift in perspective transforms ordinary problems from sources of frustration into vehicles for deepening understanding and strengthening beneficial mental habits. Integration in family relationships requires balancing the Buddhist insight into the constructed nature of personal identity with the practical necessity of fulfilling conventional roles and responsibilities. You can simultaneously recognize that parent, child, spouse, and sibling are temporary designations that do not point to solid, permanent entities, while still acting with full commitment to support the welfare of family members. This dual awareness often improves family relationships rather than undermining them because it reduces the emotional reactivity that comes from taking family dynamics too personally, while increasing genuine care that is not contaminated by possessiveness or control. Family becomes a place to practice unconditional love rather than a source of identity and validation. The application of Buddhist principles to work and career involves finding ways to earn a living that align with your deeper values, while recognizing that no profession can provide ultimate meaning or security. Right livelihood in contemporary society rarely means finding a job that is perfectly ethical by Buddhist standards, but rather choosing work that minimizes harm while maximizing your capacity to contribute positively to the welfare of others. More importantly, it means approaching whatever work you do with mindfulness, integrity, and the intention to serve, rather than to aggrandize the ego or accumulate status and possessions for their own sake. This transformation of motivation can make even mundane work meaningful, while reducing the stress that comes from leading your career to provide complete fulfillment. Financial concerns provide particularly rich opportunities for applying Buddhist insights about craving, contentment, and the distinction between wants and needs. The practice involves neither rejecting money as inherently corrupting, nor pursuing wealth as a solution to life's deeper problems, but developing a wise relationship with material resources that supports genuine well-being without creating unnecessary anxiety or greed. This might manifest as living more simply to reduce financial stress, practicing generosity to counteract possessive tendencies, or using money as a tool for supporting beneficial causes, rather than just personal comfort and security. The goal is developing enough financial wisdom to meet practical needs without becoming enslaved by the endless cycle of earning and spending that characterizes much contemporary economic life. Health challenges, including both acute illness and chronic conditions, offer profound opportunities to practice accepting impermanence and working skillfully with suffering. The Buddhist approach involves neither denying the reality of physical pain and limitation, nor adding unnecessary psychological suffering through resistance, self-pity, or blame. Physical discomfort can become a teacher that reveals the difference between unavoidable pain and optional suffering, demonstrating how much distress comes from fighting against experiences that are already happening rather than from the experiences themselves. This does not mean becoming passive about health care or accepting preventable illness, but responding to health challenges from wisdom and self-compassion rather than from fear and desperation. Social and political engagement represents one of the most complex areas of integration because it requires balancing the Buddhist emphasis on inner transformation with the obvious need for outer change in systems that create widespread suffering. The wisdom approach involves neither withdrawing from social concerns nor becoming so identified with political causes that you lose perspective about the limitations of external solutions to human problems. Buddhist social engagement typically focuses on addressing the root causes of social problems, which often involve the same mental patterns of greed, hatred and delusion that create individual suffering, rather than just treating symptoms through policy changes or institutional reforms. This might manifest as working for social justice while maintaining equanimity about outcomes, or addressing environmental issues while recognizing that lasting change requires transformation of consciousness as well as behavior. Romantic relationships provide especially intensive laboratories for practicing the integration of wisdom and love, requiring you to balance the recognition of impermanence with the commitment that intimate partnerships require. The Buddhist approach to romance involves learning to love without possessiveness, to commit without clinging, and to support another person's growth without trying to control the direction of that growth. This does not make relationships less passionate or meaningful, but often makes them more satisfying because they are based on genuine appreciation for another person's well-being rather than on meeting your own emotional needs. Conflicts become opportunities to practice patience and communication, rather than battles to determine who is right, and the inevitable changes that occur in long-term relationships are met with curiosity and adaptation rather than resistance and disappointment. Parenting provides perhaps the most demanding test of Buddhist integration because it requires maintaining wisdom and compassion under conditions of extreme responsibility, sleep deprivation, and constant demand for selfless service. The practice involves finding the balance between providing appropriate guidance and structure while allowing children to develop according to their own natures rather than your expectations and projections. Buddhist parenting means teaching through example rather than just instruction, demonstrating how to respond to difficulties with wisdom rather than reactivity, and creating conditions that support children's natural intelligence and compassion to flourish. This approach often produces children who are more confident and resilient because they are not burdened with fulfilling their parents' emotional needs or living up to impossible standards of perfection. Creative expression provides natural opportunities for practicing non-attachment to outcomes while maintaining full engagement with the creative process itself. The Buddhist approach to art, writing, music, and other creative activities involves learning to create from inspiration and joy, rather than from the compulsive need for recognition or the fear of failure. This means being willing to share your creative gifts without being attached to how others respond to them, pursuing excellence without being crushed by imperfection, and using creative work as meditation rather than as ego enhancement. Creativity becomes a form of offering to the world rather than a way of establishing your importance or achieving immortality through lasting artistic legacy. The process of aging provides continuous opportunities to practice integration as physical capabilities decline and social roles change, requiring constant adaptation to new limitations while maintaining appreciation for whatever capacities remain available. The Buddhist approach to aging involves neither denying the reality of decline nor being defeated by it, but finding new forms of contribution and engagement that match your current abilities and circumstances. This might involve shifting from active service to wisdom sharing, from physical activities to contemplative practices, or from external achievements to inner development. Successful aging demonstrates that happiness does not depend on maintaining youth and vigor, but can actually deepen as you learn to find satisfaction in simpler pleasures and more subtle forms of awareness. The integration of Buddhist practice with contemporary psychology and medical treatment requires discernment about when traditional spiritual methods are sufficient and when professional help is necessary for addressing serious mental health challenges. Buddhism offers profound insights and effective practices for working with ordinary forms of anxiety, depression, and emotional reactivity, but severe psychological disorders may require medication and therapeutic intervention that goes beyond what meditation and philosophy can provide. The wisdom approach involves using all available resources skillfully, rather than thinking that spiritual practice alone must handle every form of human suffering. This integration can actually enhance both Buddhist practice and conventional treatment by providing a broader context for understanding mental health challenges and more tools for addressing them effectively. The ultimate goal of integration is not to become a perfect practitioner, but to develop the flexibility and wisdom to respond appropriately to whatever circumstances arise without losing connection to the inner peace and freedom that spiritual practice has revealed. This means being equally comfortable in meditation retreat and family celebration, able to engage fully in worldly activities while maintaining perspective about their ultimate significance, capable of caring deeply about outcomes while accepting whatever results actually occur. Successful integration creates a life that is both fully human and deeply spiritual, demonstrating that awakening does not require leaving the world behind, but brings greater wisdom, compassion, and joy to every aspect of human experience. This represents the fulfillment of the Buddha's vision, not escape from suffering, but the transformation of suffering into wisdom, not withdrawal from life, but deeper engagement with life's infinite possibilities for learning and service.